The gas station clerk asked if the man in my back seat was okay. I was driving alone. The drive from Millhaven to my apartment is 4 hours and 20 minutes on a good night. No traffic, no construction, just the interstate unspooling through dark farmland while the radio fades in and out, and the only other headlights you see belong to trucks running freight through the night. I'd made the trip a dozen times in the past 2 years, ever since my dad's health started going sideways and I became the son who drove up on weekends to make sure he was eating and that the bills were somewhere near paid. It was a familiar drive, the kind you can do half asleep, which in hindsight is exactly the kind of thinking that gets people into trouble. This was a November night, a Sunday, maybe 11 months ago. I'd stayed later than I planned. My dad had a good day, and I didn't want to leave while it was still a good day, so I'd stretched dinner into a second cup of coffee, and then a third. And by the time I got back on the road, it was past 9. Dark already, temperature dropping. The fields on either side of the interstate had that flat winter look, harvested and bare. And the sky was the kind of deep gray that sits just above rain without committing to it. I was tired. Not dangerously so, I want to be clear about that, because where this story goes made me question my own account of it afterward, made me look for the explanation that let me off the hook. But I was alert. I had the heat on low, windows cracked a half inch to keep the air moving, coffee in the cup holder I was working through steadily. I know what driving tired feels like, and this wasn't it. I was just a man on a highway at night, heading home after a long weekend, ready for his own bed. I'd been on the road about an hour when I stopped for gas. The station was one of those isolated exits that exists for no other reason than to service the highway. A BP with a subway attached, lit up white bright against the dark, the only structure visible in any direction. 2 other cars at the pumps when I pulled in, a semi idling at the far end of the lot, running its engine against the cold. I filled up, went inside to grab another coffee and use the bathroom, did the whole thing in under 8 minutes. Nothing remarkable. The kind of stop you forget the moment you pull back onto the ramp. The clerk was young, early 20s, lanky, the kind of tired that belongs to the tail end of a long shift rather than a long drive. He rang up my coffee and a bag of pretzels without looking up. I was checking my phone for the weather when he said it. "Your friend doing okay?" I looked up. He was glancing past me, out through the large window that faced the pumps, toward my car. "Sorry?" "The guy in your back seat." He said it the same way he'd have said anything else. No alarm in it, just mild social courtesy. The kind of check-in you offer when someone looks unwell. He seemed like he wasn't feeling great, wasn't moving much. I turned and looked out the window at my car. The back seat was empty. Dark, but empty. I could see both rear windows clearly from where I stood, and there was nothing there. No silhouette, no shape, no person. Just the headrest and the shadow behind it, and the dark glass beyond. "There's nobody in my car," I said. "I'm driving alone." He looked at the car again, then back at me. Something shifted in his expression. Not quite embarrassment, more like the particular discomfort of realizing you've said something you can't take back. "Huh," he said. Must have been the reflection. I paid and left. Stood at my car for a moment before getting in, long enough to check the back seat myself. Really check it, leaning in with the door open and the overhead light on. The seat was empty. My gym bag was back there, the one I'd brought for the weekend, slumped against the far door. A jacket I'd thrown back there weeks ago. Nothing else. I got in. I adjusted my rear-view mirror, which had been knocked slightly crooked, the way it sometimes gets when you're loading things in and out. Pulled back onto the ramp. Told myself the kid had seen my gym bag in bad light and his brain had done what tired brains do, filled in the shape with something familiar. It was a reasonable explanation. The most reasonable one. I ran through it twice more in the next 20 miles, and by the time I'd finished my coffee, I'd mostly stopped thinking about it. Mostly. There's a thing that happens when someone plants a thought you can't fully uproot. You stop looking at the road the same way. Your eyes start moving differently. A quick check in the mirror, not for cars behind you, but for the back seat specifically. The way you'd check a dark corner of a room after watching something you shouldn't have. I caught myself doing it for the first time somewhere around the county line. Quick glance, nothing there, back to the road. Then again, 10 minutes later. Nothing there. Then again. I turned the radio up. I focused on the white lines. I told myself I was being an idiot, and I was, and that didn't make the feeling go away. The rain finally came around midnight. Light at first, then harder. A steady percussion on the roof of the car, the wipers dragging across the glass in that uneven rhythm they get when you need new blades. The road ahead narrowed in the headlights. The fields disappeared, and somewhere in the dark behind me, something made a sound like breathing. I pulled over. Not dramatically, and didn't swerve or brake hard. I just eased onto the shoulder the way you would if your phone slid under the seat or you needed to check your mirrors. Deliberate, calm. I put it in park and left the engine running and turned around in my seat and looked at the back of the car in the full glow of the dashboard lights. A gym bag, my jacket, a water bottle on its side that must have rolled out from somewhere. The seat itself, the one behind the passenger side, slightly compressed the way seats get after years of use. Nothing. No one. I sat there for a moment with the rain working hard on the roof. Then I got out, opened the rear passenger door, and physically checked the footwells, both of them, leaning in far enough that my shirt got damp from the door frame. Nothing. I checked the trunk through the fold-down seat panel. My jumper cables, a bag of road salt from last winter, a box of my dad's old paperbacks I kept meaning to bring up to him. Nothing. I stood in the rain on the shoulder of a dark interstate at midnight, feeling like a complete idiot. Got back in, dried my face on my sleeve, pulled back into the lane and told myself with some conviction that the sound had been the rain changing pitch as it hit different parts of the car, with the defroster cycling through, or any one of a dozen things that a 4-year-old vehicle makes on a long drive when you're paying too close attention. Cars are not quiet machines. They breathe. They expand and contract with temperature. They make sounds that your tired brain, already primed by a gas station clerk's misread reflection, will assemble into the shape of whatever you're afraid of. I believed that. I mostly still believe it, actually, which is the part of this story that's hardest to explain. The next hour was fine. More than fine. I found a good radio station out of the city, something playing old soul records, and I settled into the drive the way I'd been settled before the stop. Miles passed. The rain thinned out. I stopped checking the mirror every 10 minutes and started checking it at normal intervals, the way drivers do without thinking, looking for headlights rather than shapes in the dark. It was around 1 in the morning when I noticed the smell. Subtle at first. So subtle that I spent a few minutes thinking it was coming from outside, something agricultural drifting in through the cracked window. But it wasn't that kind of smell. It was closer and warmer than that. Stale in the way that enclosed spaces get stale and something has been in them a long time. Sweat, and something else underneath it that I couldn't maim immediately, and then did. The particular unwashed smell of an adult man who has been in the same clothes for several days. I closed the window. The smell didn't diminish. I turned the fan down, checked the vents. Told myself it was coming up from the floor mats, something tracked in on the bottom of my shoes from my dad's house. He kept a lot of old things in poorly ventilated spaces, and the smell of those spaces had a way of traveling. I told myself a lot of things in the next 10 minutes, and none of them accounted for the fact that the smell was getting stronger rather than weaker the longer I drove. My eyes went to the mirror. The back seat was dark. The overhead light from the last stop had long gone off. What I could see was the shape of the headrest, The dark rectangle of the rear window with rain running down the outside of it in thin threads, and the deep shadow below it where the seat met the backrest. The shadow was the same shade of dark it had been for the last 2 hours, the same undisturbed dark. And then the car hit a long, straight stretch, and a truck came from the other direction, and its headlights swept through the interior for less than 2 seconds. And in those 2 seconds, the shadows in the back seat moved in a way that shadows don't move on their own. I gripped the wheel, kept my speed, kept my lane. The rational explanation presented itself immediately, the way it had been doing all night, like a good, faithful assistant. The truck's headlights at that angle, the particular way my windows were tinted at the edges, the condensation on the inside of the glass distorting what the light did when it passed through. All of that, any of that. But I had seen a shape, low, reclining, pressed into the corner where the seat met the door. The shape of something folded, small, and very still. I did not pull over again. Looking back, people always want to know why. Why didn't I stop? Why didn't I get out? Why didn't I call someone? And the honest answer is the one that sounds the least rational. Because I was afraid of what would happen if I was right. Pulling over on an empty interstate at 1 a.m. to find an unknown man in the back of my car. I ran that scenario forward in my head, and it did not end anywhere I wanted to be. I had no weapon. I had no one close enough to call who could do anything useful. The nearest town with a police station was 17 miles ahead, according to the last sign I'd seen. So I drove. The radio played on. The rain came back lightly, tapping against the glass. The smell sat in the car around me like something with patience. I stared at the road ahead, and I breathed steadily, and I drove. And in the back seat behind me, something did not move, and did not make a sound. And somehow that was worse than if it had. 17 miles to the town with the police station. I know because I'd seen the sign, and I'd counted it down from that moment like a second odometer running alongside the real one. 16.8, 16.4. The radio kept playing, and I kept my hands at 10 and 2, and I did not look in the mirror again because I had made a decision, conscious, deliberate, that looking in the mirror was no longer something I was going to do. What I did instead was think. If someone was back there, and I was not prepared to fully commit to that, not yet, not at highway speed with nowhere useful to go, then they had been there since before the gas station. The clerk had seen something. Whatever he'd seen had been there before I'd gone inside, before I'd bought the coffee, before I'd stood under fluorescent lights for 8 minutes, completely unaware that my car was occupied. That meant they'd been in the back seat for at least an hour before the stop, possibly longer, possibly since Millhaven, since my dad's driveway, since I'd loaded my bag into the trunk and walked around to the driver's side and gotten in without checking. The way you don't check, because why would you? It's your own car. It's locked. It's always locked. Except I'd left it unlocked at the gas station 2 weeks before that trip, while I ran into a convenience store for less than 5 minutes. A habit I'd had for years. Small stops, quick errands, no need to lock and unlock. Stupid, I know. You don't have to tell me. 15 miles. The smell had settled into the car completely by now. Absorbed into the upholstery the way smells do in enclosed spaces, and I'd stopped being able to track whether it was getting stronger because my nose had simply accepted it as the baseline. That's the thing about prolonged exposure to something wrong. Your senses start filing it under normal, and then you have to work to remember that it isn't. I became aware, very gradually, that my breathing had gotten shallow. Not panicked. Controlled, actually, the way you breathe when you're trying to be quiet, when you're trying not to be heard. Which struck me as strange because I was the one driving. I was the one in the front. I had no reason to be quiet. And yet, some part of my brain had made the calculation without consulting me. There is something in this car that you do not want to alert to the fact that you know it is there. As long as it thinks you don't know, you have something. The moment it knows you know, you have nothing. I turned the radio down one notch, slowly, the way you'd move around a sleeping dog. 13 miles. I was passing a rest stop, closed for the season, dark, just the outline of a building set back from the ramp, when the seat behind me shifted. Not a dramatic lurch, not a sound even, just the particular creak of a car seat responding to a change in weight distribution. The same creak I'd heard 1,000 times pulling into my own driveway when I reached back for my bag. Small, organic, unmistakable. My foot came off the gas. I didn't mean it to. My body just pulled back from the accelerator the way you flinch from something hot, involuntary, before your brain has finished processing the signal. The car slowed. I pressed back down deliberately, steadily, and focused on a point in the headlights 50 yards ahead. In the rearview mirror, and I looked, I couldn't not look. My eyes went there before I could stop them. The shadow in the back seat had changed shape. Still low, still pressed against the door. But where before it had been the shape of something reclined, it was now the shape of something sitting up. He was awake. Or he'd never been asleep. Either way, he knew the rest stop had passed. He knew the next exit was miles ahead. He knew exactly where we were on this road at this hour, and if he'd been in my car as long as I thought he had, he'd done the same arithmetic I had. I thought about my phone. It was in the cup holder to my right. I could feel the edge of the case against my knuckle. I thought about what I'd say and how loudly I'd say it, and what he'd do when he heard me say it. I thought about the 18 inches of air between the front seats and how fast a person could cover that distance from a seated position. I thought about a lot of things in a very small window of time. Then I thought, toll plaza. There was one. I knew this road. 14 years of driving it since college, and there was a toll plaza 11 miles out from the city. Manned booths, at least some of them, even at this hour. Cameras, lights. A person behind glass who would see my face and my plates and, if I needed them to, would see what was in my back seat. 11 miles. I put the radio back up. Not because I wanted the noise, but because I wanted him to think nothing had changed, that I was still the oblivious driver he'd been counting on me to be. That the last 60 seconds had happened entirely inside my own head, and he was still invisible. I picked up my coffee with my right hand and took a sip I didn't taste. Behind me, in the dark, the shape did not move again, but he was sitting up now, and we both knew it. The toll plaza came up faster than I expected. One moment I was counting miles in my head, keeping my breathing even, keeping the radio at the same volume, and then the lights appeared on the horizon. That orange-yellow wash that toll plazas throw into the sky before you can see the structures themselves. I'd never been so relieved to see a toll plaza in my life. I'd never been so aware that relief can be premature. I had about 2 minutes. I used them to think through exactly what I was going to do. Not frantically. I want to be precise about this, because the version of me in that car was operating on something colder and more focused than panic. Fear had been there, and it had done its thing, and now on the other side of it was just clarity. A very simple set of variables. Me, him, a lit booth with a person inside, and whatever happened in the 30 seconds between pulling into the lane and getting through it. I took the rightmost lane, the manned one. Through the windshield I could see a woman in the booth, middle-aged, a coffee cup visible on the ledge beside her. She was looking at her phone. Normal. Ordinary. The most beautiful, ordinary thing I'd ever seen. I rolled down my window as I pulled up. She looked up from her phone and gave me the automatic half-smile of someone who has processed 10,000 transactions and will process 10,000 more. I handed her the cash before she could tell me the amount. And then I said, as levelly as I could manage, keeping my eyes on hers and not on anything behind me, "There's someone in my back seat. I don't know who he is. I need you to call the police." The half-smile didn't disappear so much as it suspended, froze in place while her brain caught up with what she'd just heard. Her eyes moved to the back seat, came back to me, moved again to the back seat. Whatever she saw, it was enough. "Pull through and stop on the shoulder past the plaza," she said. Her voice had gone flat and professional in a way that made me think she'd had some kind of training for this, or had simply worked enough late-night shifts on a highway to have developed a protocol of her own. She already had her phone off the ledge. "Don't get out of the car. I'm calling now." I pulled through, stopped on the shoulder, turned off the engine, and then sat there in the sudden silence after the engine cut, with the rain still coming down and the toll plaza lights casting long orange shapes across the hood of the car, and waited. The wait was 40 seconds, maybe less. It felt architectural, like something you could measure in load-bearing walls. The voice came from directly behind my left ear. "You didn't have to do that." Low, unhurried. The voice of a man who was not panicking, which was somehow the most frightening version of this moment I could have constructed. I did not turn around. My hand found the door handle, and I was out of the car before I'd consciously decided to move, standing in the rain on the shoulder with the door between me and the interior, one hand still on the frame. He was already sitting upright. Had been, I realized, since before the toll plaza, maybe since the rest stop. I could see him properly for the first time now in the orange light. 50s, heavy set, wearing a dark work jacket that had dried unevenly, the kind with a logo on the breast pocket too faded to read. Jeans, work boots. A face that was difficult to look at directly and impossible to look away from. Not because of anything grotesque, but because of the expression on it, which was nothing. Completely nothing. The flat, patient look of someone who had been waiting a long time and was prepared to keep waiting. He was looking at me through the open door without moving. Just looking. The first cruiser arrived in under 4 minutes. 2 officers, one of whom put himself between me and the car immediately, while the other opened the rear door and spoke to the man inside. I stood in the rain and watched and realized my legs were shaking. Not violently, just a fine, continuous tremor I hadn't noticed while I was moving, but that now, standing still, was impossible to ignore. The adrenaline finding somewhere to go. The man got out of the car without resistance. Didn't argue, didn't run, just stepped out onto the shoulder and put his hands up in the unhurried way of someone performing a familiar routine. One officer walked him to the cruiser while the other came to take my statement. I told him everything in order. Millhaven, the gas station clerk, the smell, the rest stop, the seat shifting. My own voice sounded strange to me, too steady, like it belonged to someone who had not just spent 2 hours driving a stranger through the dark. The man had 2 outstanding warrants in 2 different counties. A knife had been found in the interior pocket of his work jacket. A folding knife, nothing theatrical, the kind you can buy at any hardware store, the kind that doesn't announce itself. I sat in the back of the second cruiser while they processed the scene and thought about that knife, about the arithmetic he must have been running from the back seat, when to move, when to wait, what he was waiting for, whether he'd been waiting for me to stop somewhere dark and isolated, or whether the plan had been something else. Something I didn't have enough information to reconstruct, and probably didn't want to. I thought about how I'd nearly pulled over a second time, how I'd almost stopped at that closed rest stop when the seat shifted, how the shoulder of a dark interstate at 1 in the morning is as isolated as any place gets in this part of the country. The second officer drove me home. Didn't have to, but he did. We didn't talk much. The rain had mostly stopped by then, just a light mist, and the city lights came up slowly the way they do after a long stretch of dark highway. First a glow, then shapes, then streets I recognized. My own block, my own building. I thanked him at the curb, and meant it more than I've ever meant a thank you in my life. I sat in my apartment for a long time before I turned any lights on, not because I was afraid of what the light would show me. I'd checked every room before I sat down, opened every closet, looked under the bed the way I hadn't done since I was a kid. Force of habit now, or force of something new that hadn't found its name yet. I sat in the dark because the dark felt honest, because the last several hours had stripped something away and I wasn't ready to perform normalcy under fluorescent light quite yet. My car stayed in the parking garage for 4 days after that. I took the bus to work, walked to the grocery store 2 blocks over, found reasons not to need it. On the 5th day, I went down to the garage in the middle of the afternoon when there were other people around, and I opened all 4 doors and stood there in the concrete echo of the structure, letting the air move through it. Then I got behind the wheel and drove around the block twice and came back. That was enough for that day. I had the locks changed. Not on my apartment, on the car. New key fobs, new ignition cylinder, the whole job. The mechanic didn't ask why, and I didn't explain. While he worked, I sat in the waiting area and looked at my phone and tried to remember every time I'd left the car unlocked in the past year. There were more instances than I wanted to count. Quick stops, familiar parking lots, the kind of places that feel safe because you've been there 100 times without incident. I thought about how little that means. How uneventful history is not the same thing as actual safety. The detective who called me 3 days later was thorough and patient, and told me what she could within what she was allowed to share. The man had been sleeping in cars for several months. Not always mine, she implied, though she didn't elaborate. He'd been picked up twice before for trespassing, once for breaking and entering, charges that had moved through the system with the slow, bureaucratic indifference that such things attract when no one gets physically hurt. He was facing more serious charges now. She said it in a tone that suggested she thought the more serious charges were overdue. "Did he say anything?" I asked. "About why he got in my car, specifically?" There was a brief pause. "He said your car was unlocked and he needed somewhere warm. That was all. No specific design, no plan he'd articulated. No answer to the question I'd been turning over for 3 days. What he'd been waiting for. What the knife was for. What the end game looked like from the backseat of a stranger's car on a dark interstate in November. Maybe there wasn't an end game. Maybe the answer really was that simple and that random. An unlocked car, a cold night, a man with warrants and a folding knife who needed somewhere to sit down. I'm not sure that explanation makes it better. I've gone back and forth on whether it makes it worse. What I know is this, and I want to be careful here, because I'm not the kind of person who draws sweeping conclusions from a single bad night. But there is something this experience took from me that I haven't fully gotten back, and I think it would be dishonest to wrap this up without maiming it. It took the drive. That 4-hour stretch of interstate I'd made a dozen times, that I knew in the way you know a thing you've done so often it becomes meditative. It took that and replaced it with a checklist. Backseat before I get in, locks before I pull out, mirrors checked differently now, with a specific deliberate sweep of the rear interior that wasn't there before. Small things. The kind that become invisible after a while, folded into routine until you stop noticing you're doing them. I notice. I still notice every time. I still make the drive to Millhaven when my dad needs me. Same road, same exits, same stretch of dark farmland in the middle, where there's nothing in any direction except flat land and sky. I stop for gas at different stations now, never the same one twice, which is probably not a logical response to anything, but feels right anyway. I go inside with my keys in my hand and I lock the car every single time. The toll plaza is still there on the southbound side. Same orange lights, same booths. I pass through it on every trip home. I've had the same woman in the booth twice since that night. I recognized her both times, though I couldn't tell you whether she recognized me. Probably not. Probably that night was a Tuesday night footnote in a long career of late-shift highway work, processed and filed and mostly forgotten. I haven't forgotten her. I don't think I will. There's a version of that night where I miss the toll plaza exit, where I take the wrong lane or talk myself out of stopping the way I'd talked myself out of everything else for 2 hours, where I keep driving and he keeps waiting, and the road stays empty and dark for another 40 miles until the city. I've run that version forward more times than I should admit. I always stop it at the same place, just before it arrives somewhere I don't want to go. I got lucky. The clerk saw something through a gas station window in bad light and said something about it instead of nothing. That small, unremarkable human decision is the reason the rest of this story went the way it did. I think about him sometimes. Young guy, end of a long shift, probably drove home that night and didn't think twice. He should know it mattered. I hope in some version of the world he does. Lock your car. Check your back seat. Trust the thing in your chest that goes quiet and still when something is wrong. It knows before you do. It always knows before you do. My coworker showed me a photo from the office parking lot. Someone was sitting in the dark in my car. Marcus leaned over my desk at 12:43 on a Tuesday and said, "Hey, isn't that your car?" I remember the time because I'd just glanced at the clock on my screen, calculating whether I had enough of my lunch break left to finish what I was eating before my 1 p.m. call. I looked up. He was holding out his phone with the particular hesitance of someone who isn't sure whether they're about to be helpful or alarming, tilted toward me, close enough to see, but still in his hand, like he hadn't fully committed to showing me yet. On the screen was a photograph of the parking lot. I recognized my car immediately. 11-year-old Civic, dark green, the dented rear bumper I'd been meaning to get fixed for 2 years. Third row from the building entrance, beside the lamp post. The spot I parked in every single day because the lamp post meant I could always find it without wandering, and because the extra light felt reassuring during the winter months when 5:30 looked like midnight. "Yeah," I said. "That's mine. Why?" He didn't answer right away. He looked at the photo himself for a second, then back at me, then held the phone a little closer. "Look at the driver's seat," he said. I looked. The photo had been taken from maybe 30 feet away, angled slightly upward the way phone photos go when you're not really framing them, just pointing and shooting. The winter light was flat and gray, the lot half full with the usual midday mix of cars. Mine was in its spot. And in the driver's seat, visible through the windshield, dark interior, the particular quality of shadow inside a closed car on a cloudy day, there was a shape that was not a bag, not a coat slung over the headrest, not a trick of the light against the seat fabric. There was a person sitting in my car, upright, still, not moving in the way someone moves when they're rummaging for something or adjusting the mirror, just sitting. The posture of someone at rest, or waiting, or watching the lot through the windshield with the specific patience of a person who is not in any kind of hurry. I sat back in my chair. My lunch was still open in front of me, going room temperature, and the most ordinary thought I had in that moment was that I had my keys in my bag. I could feel the weight of them through the fabric, the specific jangle of the key ring, and that I had not been to my car since I'd arrived at 7:45 that morning. "When did you take this?" I asked. "Like 20 minutes ago, I went down to grab my gym bag from my trunk." He paused. "I almost didn't say anything. I thought maybe you'd left something in there, like someone was picking it up for you, or..." He stopped. But it looked weird, the way they were just sitting there. I told my manager I needed to step out. Marcus came with me without being asked, which I was grateful for in a way I didn't have the presence of mind to express at the time. The parking lot was cold, that particular knife-edged cold of a December noon in the Midwest. The sky the color of old concrete, the wind cutting across the open asphalt with nothing to interrupt it. Our building was part of an office park on the edge of town, the kind of development that springs up around a highway interchange. Half a dozen low corporate buildings arranged around a shared lot, a scattering of mature trees that had been there longer than any of the buildings,
a perimeter of open land that faded into scrub and then highway embankment. Functional, impersonal. The kind of place that fills up between 8 and 9 every morning and empties again between 5 and 6, and in between has the particular quality of a space where everyone has somewhere else they belong. My car was where I'd left it, third row, beside the lamppost, empty. I stood at the driver's side window with my hands in my coat pockets and looked in. The front seats, the back seat, the floor, a gym bag on the rear seat, my travel mug in the cup holder, the usual detritus of a person who spends 25 minutes in a car twice a day. Nothing that shouldn't be there. Nobody. I unlocked it and checked the back seat properly, leaning in, checking the footwell. Empty. "Maybe they left when they saw me take the photo," Marcus said from behind me. He meant it to be reassuring. It wasn't. Quite. I stood with my hand on the open door and looked at the driver's seat. Something was making me uneasy in a way I couldn't immediately name. Not the absence of whoever had been sitting there, but something about the seat itself. I stood there for a few seconds before I understood what I was looking at. The seat was pushed back, not dramatically, not shoved to the rearmost position, nothing that announced itself. Just back an inch or two further than it should have been. I'm 5'4". I've driven that car for 6 years, and the seat has lived in the same position for all of them, close to the wheel, pulled forward enough that I don't have to reach. Whoever had been sitting in it was taller than me, long enough in the leg that my position hadn't worked for them. They had adjusted the seat, had sat in my car in my spot with my seat moved to fit their body, and had been there long enough to be captured in a photograph by a man heading to his own car for his gym bag. Had sat completely still while Marcus took the picture, or hadn't seen him, or hadn't cared. I stood in the cold parking lot holding my car door open and tried to think about how someone had gotten in, because the car had been locked. I was certain of it. I was always certain of it, checking it twice by habit every morning before I crossed the lot. The lock showed no damage. The window glass was intact. There was no indication of forced entry anywhere on the car. I took one more look at the back seat, then I locked it again, and Marcus and I walked back inside, and neither of us said much on the way up. At my desk, I opened my email, stared at it for 4 minutes without reading any of it, and then asked Marcus to forward me the photo. I've looked at it a lot since then. The shape in the driver's seat, the stillness of it. Whoever it was had been in my car for at least 20 minutes, from when I'd arrived and parked to when Marcus had walked out for his gym bag. 20 minutes of sitting in a locked car in a lot full of people going about their Tuesday, completely motionless in a seat they had adjusted to fit themselves. 20 minutes at minimum. I kept coming back to that part, the 20 minutes. And the fact that I still had no idea how they'd gotten in. I filed a report with building security that afternoon. Our office park had a shared security contractor, a desk in the main lobby of the largest building, a guard who rotated between the properties on a schedule that never quite felt sufficient for a complex that size. I'd walked past that desk every morning for 2 years without once stopping at it. The guard on duty when I came down was a heavy-set man named Dale, who listened to my account carefully, looked at the photo Marcus had forwarded me, and spent a long moment studying it with the practiced neutrality of someone deciding how seriously to treat a complaint. He told me the lot had cameras. I felt something release in my chest, the first loosening of the tension that had been sitting there since Marcus held out his phone. Cameras meant footage. Footage meant an answer to how, and possibly to who, and having either one felt enormously preferable to the open-ended wrongness of not knowing. He called me the following morning to tell me the camera covering the third row had been non-operational since the previous week. Scheduled for maintenance, he said. Nobody had gotten around to it yet. I thanked him and hung up and sat in my car in the parking lot. Locked, engine running, the heat just starting to work against the December cold, and thought about the specific quality of that information. Not that the camera had malfunctioned randomly, not a technical glitch, not a weather issue. Scheduled for maintenance, a known outage, visible on whatever internal log the security contractor kept, accessible to anyone who might have looked at it or asked the right person, or simply paid attention to which cameras were blinking and which weren't. I didn't know what to do with that. I filed it away and tried not to build too much on top of it. The police, when I called the non-emergency line that evening, were polite and efficient and ultimately not very useful. No forced entry, no theft, no physical harm. What they had to work with was a photograph of a person sitting in a parked car, which could be explained a dozen different ways before you got to the alarming ones. The officer I spoke to suggested it might have been someone who got confused about which car was theirs and realized their mistake before I came back out. He said it with a kind of practiced reasonableness that I recognized as the verbal equivalent of a form letter, and I thanked him and wrote down the report number and spent the rest of the evening trying to believe it. I didn't believe it, not really. You know when something is wrong in a way that exceeds the available evidence, when the facts are ambiguous, but the feeling isn't. Something about the stillness in that photograph, about the seat adjusted to fit a body that wasn't mine, about the 20 minutes of sitting completely motionless in a public lot, didn't fit the someone got confused explanation. People who realize they've gotten into the wrong car don't sit in it composing themselves for 20 minutes. They get out. I started paying attention to the lot in a way I never had before. It's the kind of attentiveness that fear produces, a sudden sharpening of perception in a space you'd previously moved through on autopilot. I began arriving 10 minutes earlier than necessary to give myself time to cross the lot without rushing, to look at the cars around mine before I reached it, to notice what was different from the day before. I started parking under the lamppost with a new intentionality, choosing it now for the light it threw directly onto my car, rather than for the convenience of the landmark. I checked my car twice before I got in every morning and twice before I left every evening. Not just the locks, but the interior, the back seat, the footwells. And I adjusted my seat forward every single morning. It happened 3 more times over the following 2 weeks. Not every day. That was its own particular quality of horror, the irregularity of it. If it had been every day, I could have predicted it, braced for it, called the police and said it happens on a pattern. Instead, it was random enough that each discovery arrived fresh, unguarded, the seat pushed back those same 1 or 2 inches with the same implication of a body longer than mine having occupied the same position. The 3rd time, I found something else. My travel mug, the green one I kept in the cup holder, a thermal thing I'd had for years, had been moved to the back seat, set upright in the center of the rear seat, not dropped or thrown, placed, deliberately, carefully, the way you'd set something down when you were being deliberate about it. I stood at the open car door in the gray December morning and looked at it for a long time before I touched it. The 4th time, a week before Christmas, I found the seat adjusted again and something written on the inside of the passenger window. Not carved, not painted, written in the condensation, the way you write when a window is fogged from the cold outside and warm from a body recently inside. Finger-drawn letters in the moisture on the glass, already fading as the car's interior temperature dropped without someone in it. I could still read it. My name. Just my name, first and last, written in the condensation on the inside of my own passenger window. I stood in the parking lot with the door open and the December wind coming through it and looked at those letters going transparent at the edges, and something in my chest went very still in a way that felt different from any of the fear I'd experienced in the preceding 2 weeks. Not the fear of something unknown, something ambiguous, something that might have an innocent explanation if you worked hard enough at finding one. This was the fear of something that knew me, knew my name, knew my car, knew my parking spot and my routine and my travel mug and the precise position of my seat, and had been coming back, irregularly and patiently, to sit in the space I occupied for 25 minutes every morning and evening and leave evidence of themselves that stopped just short of undeniable. I took a photo of the window, then I called Marcus and asked him to come down. He was there in 4 minutes. He read the letters from the doorway without touching anything, his breath fogging in the cold, and when he looked at me, his expression had none of the careful neutrality Dale from security had managed. He just looked frightened, which was honest. And somehow that honesty was the thing that finally made me feel like I wasn't losing my mind. "You need to go back to the police," he said. "Today. in person, not the phone. He was right. I knew he was right. I'd known it since the third incident, probably. What I hadn't had until that moment, standing in a cold parking lot reading my own name written in the fog of someone else's breath on my window, was the capacity to pretend there was any other reasonable option. I went to the police station on my lunch break. Not the non-emergency line this time. In person, the way Marcus had said, sitting in a plastic chair in a waiting room that smelled of burnt coffee and industrial cleaner, while someone at the front desk took my name and told me an officer would be with me shortly. I had my phone out with the photos loaded, Marcus's original, the 3 subsequent seat adjustments I'd documented, and the window. I had the security report number from Dale. I had 2 weeks of dates and times written in my notes app, a log I'd started keeping after the second incident because something in me had understood instinctively that I was going to need to be able to account for the pattern. The detective who came out to meet me was a woman named Rains, somewhere in her 40s, with the particular quality of attention that distinguishes someone who is actually listening from someone who is waiting for you to finish. She looked at every photograph. She asked precise questions. The same spot every time, the same seat adjustment, the travel mug placed not dropped, the window written on from the inside. She didn't offer the confused about which car explanation. She didn't offer any explanation at all, which I found more reassuring than anything she could have said. She asked who knew my routine, what time I arrived, what time I left, which spot I parked in. I thought about it honestly. My manager knew my hours, my immediate team knew. The parking spot wasn't assigned. Technically, anyone could park anywhere, but in the way of office lots everywhere, people tended to claim the same space by repetition until it became understood as theirs. I'd been in that spot for 2 years. Anyone who'd watched the lot for long enough would know it was mine. "Anyone from your personal life who might know your work location?" Rains asked. "A former partner, someone you've had conflict with recently?" I'd been thinking about this since the name on the window, going back through the catalog of people who might have reason to. What? Sit in my car? Watch me? Know my full name without me having given it recently? The last relationship I'd had ended 14 months prior, mutual and undramatic, and he'd moved to another state 6 months after that. No conflicts. No one I could point to and say, this person, this is the shape of the threat. "No one I can think of," I told her. She nodded and wrote something down. Then she asked about the lock, specifically how I was certain the car had been locked each time. I told her about the habit, the twice checking, the key fob chirp I always waited to hear before I walked away. She asked whether I'd ever used a valet, whether the car had recently been serviced, whether anyone else had a spare key. The spare key, I kept it at home, in the small ceramic bowl on my kitchen counter where I put things I needed to be able to find. Batteries, rubber bands, the occasional receipt. I'd had it made at a hardware store years ago and put it there and barely thought about it since. The bowl was visible from the front door if the door was open. "Has anyone been in your home recently?" Rains asked. "Repair work, a friend with access, anyone who might have seen where you keep things?" "The maintenance man. 3 weeks before the first incident, the middle of November, a Tuesday or Wednesday. I couldn't pin it exactly. A radiator issue, building arranged. I'd left a key with the front desk the way the management company asked, and he'd had access to the apartment for the better part of an afternoon while I was at work. Standard practice. The kind of thing that happens without a second thought in every apartment building in every city," I told Rains. I watched her expression stay neutral while something behind her eyes sharpened. "Do you still have the spare key at home?" she asked. I didn't know. I realized, sitting in that plastic chair under the fluorescent lights, that I hadn't checked, hadn't thought to. The bowl was just there, part of the furniture of my kitchen counter, and I reached into it occasionally without inventorying its contents. I could not have told her with certainty that the key was still in it. She sent a patrol officer to the management company that afternoon to request the maintenance log, specifically the name and employment record of whoever had been in my unit in November. She called me at 4:17 p.m. while I was sitting at my desk pretending to review a spreadsheet. The maintenance company had no record of any work order for my unit in November. I made her repeat it. She did. No work order for my apartment in the 6 weeks prior to our conversation. The management company had confirmed it. They'd checked twice, gone back through the digital system and the paper backup. Nothing. I sat very still at my desk with the phone against my ear and the open plan office moving around me with its ordinary Tuesday afternoon energy, and I thought about a man I'd never seen clearly, in an apartment I'd left unlocked for him for an afternoon, standing at my kitchen counter looking into a ceramic bowl. "I need you to go somewhere that isn't your apartment tonight," Rains said. "Is there somewhere you can go?" There was. My sister lived 20 minutes away. I'd been keeping her at the edge of this, not wanting to alarm her, not wanting to say the words out loud that would make it fully real. I called her from the parking lot with my car locked and the engine running and told her I needed to stay over, that I'd explain when I got there. She didn't ask questions. She just said, "Come." The drive over was 23 minutes of stoplights and winter dark and the specific feeling of a person moving through a city they've lived in for years, while the city stays exactly the same and something fundamental about their experience of it has shifted. The streets were the same streets. The lights were the same lights. Every car that stayed behind me through 2 consecutive turns made my hands tighten on the wheel. I checked my rearview mirror the entire way. I didn't relax until I heard my sister's deadbolt click behind me. Even then, not fully, not for a long time after that. My sister's name is Deb. She's 4 years older than me, practical in the way that middle children sometimes are, the kind of person who responds to a crisis by making tea and asking specific questions rather than cycling through emotions at you. I told her everything that night at her kitchen table: the photo, the seat, the travel mug, the window, the maintenance man who had no work order. She listened without interrupting, which is harder than it sounds when the story keeps getting worse. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment, both hands around her mug. "You're not going back to that apartment alone," she said. Not a question. I wasn't planning to. Rains had made that clear, and Deb made it clearer, and for once in my life I didn't argue with either of them about my own capability to handle something. Some situations are not about capability. Some situations are about the specific, non-negotiable wisdom of not being alone in a place that has been accessed by someone who knows your name and your spare key, and the exact position your car seat needs to be in to fit your body. Rains called me the next morning at 8:52. She had a name. The maintenance company, not the one the building used officially, she explained, but a secondary contractor that had been subcontracted for overflow work the previous spring, the arrangement handled informally enough that the primary company's records were incomplete, had an employee whose access log showed a visit to the building on the relevant date. Not to my unit specifically, she was careful to say, but to the building. He had been in the building that day. His name was given to me as a formality, as information I was entitled to, and I won't include it here because he hasn't been convicted of anything, and I've been advised to be careful about that. What I will tell you is that Rains then told me something that made the kitchen go very quiet around me, even though I was the only person in it. He had worked for that subcontractor for 8 months. He had been assigned to my building, not exclusively, but regularly, for 5 of those 8 months. His access log showed 11 visits to the building over that period. 11 documented entries, the kind that get logged when a contractor checks in through the front desk and signs for a key card. 11 visits over 5 months. I'd been in that apartment for 7 months total. The math was simple, and I did it immediately, and I sat with the result of it for a long time without saying anything. Rains let me. She'd done the same math herself before she called me, and she understood what it meant, and she gave me the space to arrive at it at my own pace. 11 logged visits, which meant 11 visits that were official enough to sign in for. Whatever unofficial visits might have accounted for, a side entrance propped, a copied key used without checking in. Those 11 didn't include. 11 that I knew about. She had also pulled the surveillance footage from 2 buildings over. Not my lot. The non-operational camera had seen to that. but the adjacent property shared a sight line with the far end of my company's lot, and their system had been functioning. The footage was partial, the angle poor, but it showed a vehicle parked at the edge of their lot on 4 of the days I'd documented an incident. Same vehicle each time. Dark, mid-size, partial plate that matched enough to pursue. He had been parked there, watching the lot, watching me cross it in the morning, watching me come back at 5:30, and then at some point, in the window between when I walked in and when Marcus happened to walk out, crossing the lot himself and getting into my car and sitting in it. Why? That was the question I couldn't stop turning over. Not the how anymore. The how had an answer now, the spare key in the ceramic bowl. The afternoon in November when the door I'd left unlocked for a maintenance call gave him the time he needed. The why was harder. Sitting in a car was not theft, not vandalism, not a communicable threat. The name on the window was the most overtly frightening thing, and even that was just letters, my name, which I had not given him, which he had acquired somewhere in the apparatus of access to a building and a subcontract, and a woman who kept her spare key in a bowl by the door. I asked Rains what it meant in legal terms, what any of it meant, what they could do with it. She was honest with me in the way that I was beginning to understand was her default mode. Stalking statutes, she said, required a pattern of conduct that caused a reasonable person to feel fear. What I had, the documentation, the photo, the incidents I'd logged, constituted a case. Not airtight, she said, but a case. She was pursuing it. She said this with the particular firmness of someone who intends to be believed and is. He was contacted by investigators 2 days later. Rains called me an hour after that conversation happened to tell me it had occurred and to tell me what he had said, which was that he sometimes sat in empty lots on his lunch break to decompress and must have gotten confused about which car was his. He said the name on the window had been there when he got in. He said he didn't know what I was talking about with the seat. I listened to all of it. Then I asked Rains what she thought. She took a half-second pause that told me everything. "I think you should keep documenting," she said. "I think you should change your routine. Different parking spot, different times where you can manage it. And I think you should take the spare key out of the bowl and put it somewhere that isn't visible from the door." I'd already changed the locks by then. Had done it the morning after the first night at Deb's, a locksmith Deb had found and called herself while I was still drinking my coffee. New deadbolt, new spare key, the old one left wherever it had gone. In a pocket of his, in a drawer somewhere, useless now. But I took the bowl off the counter anyway. I couldn't look at it anymore without thinking about him standing there, looking into it, turning that small metal key over in his hand while my radiator did whatever it was doing that afternoon, and my apartment sat quiet around him, and I was 20 minutes away at my desk with no idea. I put the bowl in a cabinet. Then I stood in my kitchen in the thin December light, and I looked at the counter where it had been, and I thought about all the ways a person makes themselves at home in a space, the specific texture of a routine, the objects you stop seeing because they're always there, and how completely that comfort depends on the assumption that the space is yours, only yours, that no one else has stood in it, handled it, memorized it, in the hours when you weren't there to know. The case moved slowly, the way these things do. Rains was thorough and consistent, and kept me informed at every stage with the kind of regular contact that I came to understand was above and beyond what most people in my situation received, and I was grateful for it in a way that also made me quietly furious, that it required a particular detective's particular decency to ensure that a woman reporting a pattern of targeted intrusion stayed informed about her own case. That without Rains it might have been different. That for a lot of people it is different. The stalking charge was filed in February, 6 weeks after the first in-person report. The footage from the adjacent lot, my documentation, the maintenance access logs, the spare key provenance, collectively, it was enough to move forward. I gave a formal statement in a conference room, not unlike the one from the camera story, sitting across from a prosecutor who read from a typed summary of events that had been my life for the preceding months and which, flattened into bullet points and case language, managed to be both accurate and somehow entirely insufficient. The words on the page were correct. They just couldn't hold the weight of what it had actually felt like to stand in a parking lot in December reading your own name written in someone else's breath. I don't know the final outcome. I want to be honest about that rather than tidy it up into a resolution it hasn't fully earned. The last communication I received from the prosecutor's office indicated the case was proceeding, that there would be a hearing, that I would be contacted if my testimony was required. That contact hasn't come yet. I check my email sometimes with a specific quality of dread and relief mixed together, dreading what it might ask of me, relieved that the asking would mean something is finally concluding. In the meantime, I moved. That was the first practical decision, and the one that required the least deliberation. I gave notice on the apartment 3 weeks after the lock change, forfeited part of the deposit rather than argue about it, and let Deb help me find a place in a building with a staffed front desk and electronic fob entry and a parking structure with its own attendant booth rather than an open surface lot. The new apartment is on the 4th floor. I chose the 4th floor deliberately. Ground level felt like a different thing to me now than it had before, and I needed the elevation in a way that was partly practical and partly something less rational, the instinct of a person who has learned that visibility cuts both ways, that being easy to see also means being easy to watch. I still work at the same company, still see Marcus at the adjacent desk cluster 5 days a week. He asks, occasionally, and without making it a thing, how I'm doing. The specific inquiry of someone who was present for part of it and carries a small piece of the weight of it himself. He was the one who noticed. He was the one who leaned over my desk at 12:43 on a Tuesday with his phone tilted toward me, hesitant, not sure whether he was about to be helpful or alarming. I think about that choice of his sometimes, how easily he might have looked at the photo and thought it wasn't his business, thought it was probably nothing, thought he didn't want to make things awkward, how different the shape of everything would be if he had. I park in the structure now, 4th level, near the elevator, under the overhead light, a spot I chose on my first day in the new building and have parked in every day since, with an intentionality that would have seemed excessive to me 2 years ago and seems entirely reasonable to me now. I check my car before I get in. I check the back seat every single time, not from panic, not with shaking hands, just a quick, deliberate scan, a practice I've incorporated into the sequence of getting into a car the way you incorporate checking your mirrors. It takes 4 seconds. 4 seconds is nothing. What costs more than 4 seconds is the other thing, the ambient recalibration that happened somewhere in those December weeks and has never fully recalibrated back. I notice things now that I didn't use to notice. A car that seems to be going the same direction for longer than feels coincidental. A person who appears in my peripheral vision twice in the same afternoon in different contexts. The particular quality of attention from a stranger that sits 1 degree past ordinary. Before November of that year, I would have processed these observations and released them without retention, the way most people do, the way you can afford to do when nothing has ever given you a reason to file them. Now I file them. I hold them for a day or two, let them either accumulate into a pattern or dissolve into coincidence, and only then let them go. This is not a bad way to move through the world, I've come to think. Uncomfortable sometimes, occasionally exhausting, but not wrong. The woman I was before, who left a spare key in a bowl visible from the door, who walked across a parking lot every morning on autopilot, who never once looked at her car before she reached it. That woman's confidence wasn't wisdom. It was just the absence of a reason to know better. I know better now. The thing I come back to most, the detail that sits at the center of everything else, is still the seat. Not the name on the window, though that was its own specific horror. Not the 11 access logs. Not the camera outage. Not any of the pieces that the investigation surfaced. The seat, pushed back 1 or 2 inches, adjusted to fit a body that was not mine. The deliberateness of it, the comfort of it, the implication of a person who had been inside my locked car in my specific space and had made it fit themselves, had settled into it with enough ease and enough time to want to be comfortable in it. That's the thing about being studied by someone who means you harm. It isn't always loud. It isn't always obvious. Sometimes it looks like a parking spot and a Tuesday and a coworker who almost didn't say anything. Sometimes it looks like nothing at all, until the moment someone turns a phone screen toward you and you see that it doesn't. The detective showed me 50 photos of my house taken from across the street. They spanned several months. The folder was manila, standard issue, the kind that holds tax documents or medical records or anything else you file away and forget about. Detective Paulson slid it across the table without preamble. No warning, no softening, just the flat scratch of cardboard on laminate, and then her hands folded on top of it, waiting. "I need you to look through these," she said. "Take your time." I looked at the folder for a moment before I opened it. The room was small, conference room off the main floor of the precinct, one of those spaces that exists purely for conversations nobody wants to have in public. Fluorescent light, a box of tissues on the corner of the table that I hoped I wouldn't need. Paulson sat across from me with the patience of someone who had done this before and knew better than to rush it. Inside the folder were photographs, printed on standard paper, slightly overexposed the way photos get when you run them through a precinct printer rather than a proper lab. I turned the first one over and looked at it and didn't understand what I was seeing for a full 2 or 3 seconds. It was my house, taken from across the street, from somewhere at roughly sidewalk level, low angle, slightly oblique, framing the front face of the property the way a real estate listing might, except grainier, less deliberate. The front porch, the 2 windows flanking the door, the oak tree in the yard that dropped leaves for 3 solid months every autumn and clogged the gutter on the north side. My car in the driveway, which meant this one had been taken on a day I was home. I turned to the next one. Same angle, slightly different light. Later in the day, maybe, the shadows falling longer across the front walk. My car still there. The one after that was taken at night. The porch light was on. I kept it on a timer, dusk to 11, and the 2 front windows were lit from inside. Through the left window, which was the living room, there was the faint blue flicker of the television. I set that one face down on the table and looked up at Paulson. "How many?" I said. 53, she said. "That we found. My name is Marcus. I'm 38. I work in insurance underwriting, and I have lived alone in that house for 4 years. I bought it after my divorce came through. Nothing complicated or dramatic, just the quiet dissolution of something that had been unraveling slowly enough that by the end we were both mostly relieved. My ex-wife, Carla, moved back to her home state. I kept the house we'd rented together, scraped together enough to make a down payment, and settled into a life that was smaller than before but felt, on most days, like something I'd actually chosen. It was a good house. Modest. 3 bedrooms, 1.5 baths, a yard that was more work than I consistently gave it. The street was quiet, the kind where people wave from their driveways and leave vegetables on each other's porches in late summer when the gardens get out of hand. My neighbor to the left was an older woman named Ruth Ann who brought over pie at Christmas and once spent 45 minutes telling me about a dream she'd had featuring my oak tree. To the right, a young couple who kept to themselves and played music I could faintly hear through the shared fence on weekend evenings. Nothing remarkable. Nothing that had ever given me reason to sit in a precinct conference room turning over photographs of my own front door. I went back to the folder and made myself look through the rest. They were not all the same. That was the first thing I noticed as I moved through the stack. The light changed, the seasons changed, the small visible details of a life in motion shifted from image to image. In one, there was a wreath on my front door that I'd put up around Thanksgiving and taken down late because I'd kept forgetting. In another, my car was absent and there was a delivery box on the porch step, the kind that sat there for a couple of days because I'd been traveling for work. In a third, taken from a slightly different position, a few feet further left, closer to the corner, there were 2 cars in the driveway. Mine and my brother's old Jeep, which he'd driven up for a weekend in March. Someone had documented the ordinary rhythm of my days with the consistency of a naturalist logging field observations. I turned over the last photograph in the stack and stopped. It was different from the others. Same street, same angle. But this one had been taken not of the house, but of me, standing on my own front porch, key in hand, apparently just arrived home. Head slightly down the way it gets when you're tired and not thinking about anything in particular. Jacket I recognized from last November, collar up against the cold. I was looking at a photograph of myself taken from across the street without my knowledge, and I had no idea by whom or why or how many times I had stood exactly like that without realizing I was being watched. I set it down on top of the others. My hands were steady, which surprised me. "When does the earliest one date from?" I asked. Paulson had been watching me move through the stack with that same careful patience. She reached across and sorted through the pile until she found the one she was looking for, turned it to face me. It took me a moment to orient to it. The oak tree was fuller, deep summer green, the yard slightly more overgrown than I kept it now. My car in the driveway, but not my current car. The one before, the one I'd traded in almost 3 years ago. 3 years of photographs. "Where did you find these?" I asked. Paulson folded her hands again on the table. "That," she said, "is what I need to talk to you about." The photographs had been found in a storage unit, not mine. A unit registered to a man named Dennis Polk, no relation to the detective, she clarified, which under different circumstances might have been funny. Polk was 52, lived alone in a rental apartment about 1.5 miles from my street, worked intermittently as a day laborer through a temp agency downtown. He had no prior record beyond a single disorderly conduct charge from 2014 that had been pleaded down to a fine. On paper, he was unremarkable in every direction, the kind of person who exists at the edges of a city's population without generating much friction. The storage unit had come to the department's attention through a property dispute, a billing issue, an unpaid balance, the facility's standard process of inventorying abandoned contents before auction. One of the facility employees had opened the unit, looked at what was inside, and called the police instead of the auction house. Paulson walked me through this methodically without dramatizing it, which I appreciated and also found quietly unbearable. She had a way of delivering information in a tone that was almost gentle, the voice of someone who understood that the facts themselves were the hard part and didn't need to be dressed up. The storage unit, she said, contained the photographs, a physical printer, a folding chair and a small table, a thermos, a pair of binoculars, mid-range quality, the kind sold at outdoor sporting goods stores, a notebook, spiral-bound, with dates and handwritten observations that the department was still working through, and approximately 4 years of prepaid phone records that they were in the process of subpoenaing. I let that settle for a moment. "He sat in there," I said. "We believe so, yes, on a number of occasions." "With the photographs and the notebook?" "Yes." I looked at the tissue box on the corner of the table. Didn't need it. I wasn't anywhere near tears. What I felt was something more structural than grief, something that was rearranging the furniture inside me without asking permission. I was trying to build a mental picture of a man I had never met sitting in a storage unit surrounded by photographs of my house, writing things down in a notebook, and I couldn't make the image stay flat and manageable the way I needed it to. "Do you know how long he'd been using the unit?" I asked. "The rental agreement goes back 4.5 years, Paulson said. 6 months longer than the earliest photograph, so the photographs weren't the beginning. Whatever this was, it had started before the photographs, or at least simultaneously with the decision to document things. Before he'd even picked up a camera, Dennis Polk had rented a space to put the evidence in. That was the part that wouldn't leave me alone as I sat in that conference room. Not the watching itself, but the infrastructure around it. The planning, the unit, the chair, the thermos, like he was settling in for something long-term. Something that warranted the kind of preparation you make when you expect to be at a thing for a while. "How did he know me?" I asked. "Do you know where this started?" Paulson's expression shifted slightly. the first crack in that professional neutrality, just a flicker. We're still working on the full picture. What we do know is that he worked a job at a landscaping company in the fall of 2020. There are records of that company doing work on your street, several properties, yours included. I remembered it vaguely. A crew that had come through one September, trimming hedges and aerating lawns, the kind of thing the neighborhood association occasionally arranged. I hadn't paid much attention. They'd been there for a day or two, maybe 3. A day or two. That was apparently enough. The thought of it, a man moving through my yard with a rake, looking at my house, looking at my windows, making some kind of internal decision that led directly to a storage unit and a folding chair and 4 years of sitting in the dark with a notebook, made my stomach turn in a way I hadn't felt yet in that conversation. Everything before had been terrible in an abstract, processing way. This was physical. "Has he been following me?" I asked. "Outside the house, I mean. Has he been?" The notebook entries are primarily location-based. Your address, times of arrival and departure, vehicle observations. We haven't yet found evidence of contact or following beyond the immediate vicinity of the property. She paused. "But Marcus, I want to be clear. The investigation is active. We're still going through everything." Which meant, we don't know the full scope yet. Which meant, there may be more. I nodded. The fluorescent light above us hummed at a frequency I hadn't noticed when I walked in and now couldn't stop hearing. "Where is he now?" I asked. "In custody. He was picked up yesterday morning. He's been charged with stalking and criminal surveillance, and the DA is reviewing for additional charges depending on what the phone records show." She said it cleanly, directly, like it was meant to reassure me. It did, and it didn't. Because here was the thing I couldn't say out loud in that room, the thought that had been threading itself through every answer she gave me like a needle-pulling wire. Dennis Polk had been watching my house for somewhere between 3 and 4.5 years. That was not a phase or an episode. That was not a fixation that flared up and cooled down. That was a sustained, organized, deliberate practice that had been running quietly in the background of my life for roughly the entire time I had lived in that house. 4.5 years ago, I was newly divorced. I was learning the creak of new floorboards. I was figuring out how to cook for one and whether I was okay with the quiet, and most nights deciding that I was. I had been building a life I thought was private. I drove myself to that precinct. I would have to drive myself home. I would have to pull into my driveway and walk up my front porch steps and unlock my front door. And every single thing about that sequence had just become something different than it was this morning. "What happens next?" I asked. Paulson slid a card across the table, her direct number, a victim's advocate contact, a website for a support resource I wouldn't look at for another 3 weeks, but eventually would. "We'll keep you informed as the investigation develops," she said, "and I'd like to assign a patrol unit to do regular drive-bys of your property for the time being, if you're comfortable with that." I almost said I wasn't going home. I almost said I didn't know how to do that, go back to that house now, walk through the door with the folder of photographs under my arm, and stand in my own kitchen and be a person again. Instead, I picked up her card and said thank you and stood up. I sat in my car in the precinct parking lot for 40 minutes before I could make myself start the engine. I drove home the long way, not because I was lost, not because traffic forced it. I just couldn't make myself take the direct route, couldn't bring myself to pull onto my street before I absolutely had to. So I went 4 blocks out of the way, looped through the commercial strip near the highway, sat at 2 red lights I didn't need to be at. Buying minutes, trying to locate the version of myself that knew how to walk through a front door without cataloging every angle from which that door could be observed. I pulled into the driveway at 4:23 in the afternoon. The house looked exactly like it always looked. That sounds obvious, but I want to be precise about it. I had half expected something to be visibly different, some physical alteration that would match the magnitude of what I now knew. There was nothing. Same oak tree, same porch, same 2 front windows with the afternoon light hitting the glass at the low angle it always hit in October. A neighborhood exactly as quiet as it had always been. I sat in the car and looked at the house from the driveway. From across the street, the angle would be slightly different. More elevation of the porch, the door more centered in frame. I found myself calculating it without meaning to, triangulating the field of view, working out what you could see from the sidewalk versus the corner versus the narrow strip of public easement between the Ruth Ann's property and the telephone pole. I made myself stop. Gripped the steering wheel once, hard, then let go. The folder was on the passenger seat. I left it there when I got out of the car. Inside, the house did what houses do. It absorbed me back into its rhythms without ceremony. The refrigerator hummed. The oak tree shifted against the front window in the early evening wind. The floorboard near the bathroom creaked when I stepped on it, same as it always had. I stood in the kitchen for a while without turning the lights on, watching the last of the daylight drain out of the backyard, and I tried to think clearly about what I knew and what I still didn't. What I knew. Dennis Polk had watched my house for somewhere between 3 and 4.5 years. He had documented my movements, arrival times, departures, vehicle presence, in a spiral notebook. He had photographed the exterior of my property with enough consistency to map the seasons of my life. He had done all of this from a storage unit 1.5 miles away, which he had furnished with a chair and a thermos like a man who intended to stay. What I didn't know, everything else. That second category was the problem. Paulson had been careful, professional, appropriately measured. She'd given me what they had confirmed and declined to speculate on what they hadn't. But the shape of what she'd left out was its own kind of information, the phone records still being subpoenaed, the notebook entries still being worked through, the qualifier beyond the immediate vicinity of the property sitting in my memory like a splinter, because beyond the immediate vicinity was everywhere. It was my office building downtown. It was the grocery store and the gas station and the 2 bars I went to occasionally with friends from work. It was everywhere I had ever been and thought nothing of. I turned the kitchen light on, then the living room, went through the house methodically, every room, every light, until the place was lit up completely and the windows threw rectangles of yellow out into the dark yard. Let someone look. I was done managing sight lines. Paulson called that evening while I was sitting at the kitchen table not eating the dinner I'd made. She had something new, she said, and wanted me to hear it before it came through other channels. They'd found a second notebook, different from the first, not the spiral-bound observation log, but something smaller, pocket-sized, tucked into the lining of a jacket hanging on the hook inside the storage unit. The entries in it weren't observational. They were something closer to personal, she said, choosing the word carefully. Notes and reflections, written in the first person with a consistency and volume that suggested they had been kept for some time. He wrote about me, I said. It wasn't a question. He wrote about the house, Paulson said, and about what he observed, and yes, about you specifically, with some frequency. What did he say? A pause. I can share specifics once the documentation has been fully processed. I don't want to characterize it incompletely. Another pause, different from the first, more deliberate. What I can tell you is that the entries reflect a level of familiarity that suggests he felt, in his own perception, that he knew you, your habits, your moods as he interpreted them from observation, your routines in significant detail. Your moods as he interpreted them from observation. I set my fork down on the table. A man I had never met, never spoken to, never been within arm's length of, had formed an opinion of my moods, had watched me from across the street on enough separate occasions to think he understood something about who I was, had gone home afterward and written it down. Marcus, Paulson said, I want to ask you something, and I want you to take a moment with it before you answer. In the past few years, any period, any incident, did you ever notice someone watching your house? A car parked on the street that seemed to recur? Anyone on foot who seemed to appear more than once? I thought about it carefully. I owed her that. There had been a car, a dark sedan, older model, that I'd noticed maybe a year ago parked at the far end of the block. I'd seen it on 2 or 3 occasions and thought nothing of it. People parked on residential streets. That wasn't news. I'd never looked closely enough to note the plate, never had a reason to. I told her this. She asked me to try to recall what I could about it. Make, approximate year, any distinguishing features. I gave her what I had, which wasn't much. She thanked me and said someone would follow up. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time after we hung up. The house was all lit up around me, every room burning, and still it felt like the most exposed I had ever been inside my own walls. Because the thing Paulson had just confirmed, beneath the careful professional language, was this. Dennis Polk believed he knew me. Not my schedule, not my car. Me. Some assembled version of me stitched together from long-distance observation and projection and whatever ran in the space between his ears when he sat in that storage unit and looked at photographs. He had constructed a relationship in his own mind, built it over years, furnished it the way he'd furnished that unit, methodically, patiently, with the confidence of a man who intended to keep going. And until 3 days ago, the only obstacle between that interior world and mine was a street I'd walked across 1,000 times without thinking twice. I didn't sleep in the house that night. I told myself I was going to. Made dinner, cleaned the kitchen, went through all the motions of a normal evening with the determination of a man refusing to be driven out of his own home by someone who was currently sitting in a holding cell 1.5 miles away. I watched television without retaining a single frame of it. I locked the front door and checked it twice, and then checked it a 3rd time with my hand flat against the wood, feeling the solidity of it, reminding myself that solid things existed. Around midnight, I got up, packed a bag, and drove to my brother Kevin's house 20 minutes away. He didn't ask questions. That's the thing about Kevin. We have the particular shorthand of 2 people who grew up in the same rooms. And when I showed up at his door with a duffel bag and a face that apparently said everything, he just stepped back and pointed down the hall. His wife, Glennis, brought me a beer I didn't ask for and sat with me in the kitchen for an hour before they both went to bed. And I sat in the quiet of someone else's house and felt, for the first time since that conference room, like I could breathe correctly. I went back to my house the next morning. In daylight. That part was important. The first thing I did was walk the perimeter of my property, something I had never once done with any intentionality in 4 years of living there. I went slowly, looking at what was visible from the street at various angles. The living room window, uncovered, showed approximately the left half of the couch and the television. The bedroom window on the east side, my bedroom where I slept, where I dressed in the morning, had a curtain I'd hung loosely, the kind that filtered light without blocking it. From the street, with the interior lamp on, you could see a diffuse glow and the vague movement of shapes. Not details, but enough to know when someone was in the room. I ordered blackout curtains that afternoon, had them installed by the end of the week. The thing about that week, the one immediately after the precinct, after Paulson's calls, after Kevin's spare bedroom, is that it existed in a kind of double exposure. On the surface, I was functioning. I went to work. I answered emails. I had a conversation with a colleague about a claims discrepancy that I somehow navigated with apparent competence. Underneath all of it, constantly, was the investigation, the notebook, the phone records being subpoenaed somewhere downtown, the slow process of uncovering the full scope of something I still didn't have the edges of. Paulson called on Thursday with an update I hadn't anticipated. The phone records had come back faster than expected. Dennis Polk had owned 3 prepaid phones over the course of the past 4 years, cycling through them every 12 to 18 months, a practice that suggested, she said carefully, some awareness of the traceable nature of what he was doing. The records from those phones were being examined. Most of the activity was unremarkable. But there was a pattern of location data that placed one of the phones, on multiple occasions, in areas beyond my residential street. My office building appeared in the data. 3 times over 18 months, the phone had pinged a tower that served the 2-block radius around my downtown office. Each instance on a weekday, during working hours. I was sitting at my desk when she told me this. My actual desk, at my actual office. The one that apparently appeared in the location data of a prepaid phone belonging to a man who had watched my house for 4.5 years. I looked up from my monitor at the open-plan floor around me, colleagues at keyboards, the low ambient noise of a functioning workplace, and tried to locate the threat in it, and couldn't, because there was none. Not now, not anymore. That was the cruelest part. It was over in the legal sense. Dennis Polk was in custody, charged, the machinery of consequence grinding forward in the way it was supposed to. He could not physically be watching me at this moment. I knew that. My nervous system did not know that and did not particularly care about the distinction. Was he following me? I asked. Downtown. Was he physically there? We can't confirm physical presence from location data alone, Paulson said. The phone could have been in a vehicle in the area, stationary without him leaving the car, or he could have been on foot. We're looking at business surveillance footage from those dates to see if we can put him in the area visually. A man possibly sitting in a car outside my office building, 3 times in 18 months, watching the door, maybe, watching people come and go, trying to match schedules, building a fuller picture of a life he had decided to map. I asked for the specific dates. She gave them to me, and I wrote them down on a notepad and then sat looking at what I'd written. 3 dates over a 1.5 years. I tried to remember those specific days, what I'd done, whether I'd stood outside the building for any reason, taken a call on the front steps, waited for someone, paused to look at my phone. I remembered one of the dates, a Thursday in July, 2 summers ago. I'd gone out front to eat lunch because the weather was good and the office felt stuffy. Sat on the low concrete wall near the entrance for maybe 30 minutes with a sandwich and my phone. Had exchanged a few texts with Carla, actually. We were still in the careful early phase of learning how to be cordial. And I remembered the warmth of the sun and feeling more okay than I'd felt in a while. I had been watched on that day. Possibly. That particular Thursday in July when I'd sat in the sun and felt briefly like things were going to be fine. I put the notepad face down on my desk. There's a version of this where the story ends there, with the charges filed and the evidence cataloged and the slow procedural work of justice rolling forward. And in some ways it did end there, at least the acute phase of it. Dennis Polk was held without bail pending trial. Paulson kept me updated through the process with a consistency that I came to genuinely depend on. The phone records eventually confirmed what we suspected without resolving everything we wanted answered. But the part that didn't end, the part I want to be honest about, was the recalibration, the quiet ongoing work of relearning how to inhabit spaces that hadn't changed except in your understanding of them. That Thursday in July was inside it now, permanently, and there was no legal proceeding in the world that was going to take it back out. The trial was 8 months later. I testified for less than 20 minutes. Paulson had prepared me well, told me what to expect, walked me through the courtroom layout, explained that my role was narrow and factual, and that the physical evidence would do the heavier work. She was right. The photographs, the notebooks, the phone records, the storage unit inventory. All of it entered into evidence with a quiet procedural thoroughness that felt almost anticlimactic after everything that had preceded it. Dennis Polk sat at the defense table in a gray suit that looked recently purchased and slightly wrong on him, like a costume assembled by someone who understood the concept of courtroom attire without quite inhabiting it. I had spent a significant amount of mental energy in the preceding months, trying to prepare myself for seeing him, constructing scenarios, rehearsing reactions, trying to decide in advance what I would feel. None of it was useful. When I finally looked at him directly, what I felt was less than I expected, and worse than I expected simultaneously. He was ordinary. That was the thing I couldn't get past, sitting in that witness box, the absolute, unremarkable ordinariness of him. Middle-aged, slightly soft, hair thinning at the crown, the kind of face you don't retain after passing it on the street. He had watched my house for 4.5 years, and he looked like someone's forgettable uncle. He was convicted on 2 counts of stalking and 1 count of criminal surveillance. sentenced to 3 years, eligible for parole at 18 months. Paulson called me when the verdict came in, and I thanked her, and I meant it. She had been, through all of it, the clearest and most reliable thing in a process that had very little clarity in it. We said goodbye in the way of two people who both understand that this particular relationship, built on the worst months of someone's life, has reached its natural conclusion. I stayed in the house. I want to be clear about that because I think it matters. Because the narrative pressure of an experience like this is always toward flight, toward the clean slate of somewhere new, and I understand why people make that choice. But I had bought that house. It had my name on a deed. I had spent 4 years filling it with the specific clutter of a life being rebuilt from scratch, and I was not willing to let the geometry of Dennis Polk's obsession determine where I was allowed to live. So I stayed. I put up the blackout curtains, and I added a second deadbolt, and I let Kevin install a camera system on the exterior that I reviewed exactly once before, deciding I didn't actually want to watch footage of my own property from inside my own kitchen. The camera stays. I just don't watch it daily. Ruth Ann, my neighbor, brought over a casserole when she heard something had happened. I never told her the full extent of it, but she seemed to understand that the full extent was significant, and she didn't push. That casserole might be the kindest thing anyone has ever done for me. What I want to say about the aftermath, about the long, slow work of living inside a thing like this after the legal part is closed, is that it doesn't resolve the way you want it to. The trial gave me a verdict. The verdict gave me a sentence. The sentence gave me nothing I could actually use on a Tuesday evening when the oak tree moved against the window in an unfamiliar way and my heart rate spiked before my brain caught up. The hypervigilance comes and goes. That's the most accurate thing I know how to say about it. There are weeks now when I barely think about it. When I walk up my front porch steps and unlock my door, and the act is simply the act, unremarkable, mine again. And then there are other times, less predictable, when something small trips a wire I didn't know was still live. A car I don't recognize parked at the far end of the block. Someone standing still on the sidewalk across the street, looking at their phone. Nothing. Always nothing. But the body remembers what the mind is trying to move past, and it doesn't particularly care about the distinction. I went back and looked at the folder once. The 53 photographs Paulson had returned to me after the trial, evidence no longer needed. Sat at my kitchen table with them spread out and made myself look at everyone. I was trying to do something deliberate with it, trying to reclaim the images somehow, to look at my own house and see my house rather than documentation of a surveillance campaign. It mostly worked. That's the honest answer. Not completely, but mostly. The last photograph in the stack, the one of me on the porch, key in hand, head down, collar up against the November cold, I looked at for a long time. Tried to find something in it, some evidence of what I didn't know in that moment. There was nothing to find. I looked exactly like a man coming home at the end of the day. Tired, probably thinking about dinner, completely unaware. I put that one back in the folder, and the folder in a drawer, and the drawer I mostly don't open. My brother asks occasionally if I'm okay. I tell him yes, and most of the time, I'm telling the truth. Glennis sends food sometimes, the same way Ruth Ann does, which I've come to understand is the language people use when they don't know what words are adequate. I still check the deadbolt twice before bed. I'm not sure I'll ever stop doing that, but the light in the kitchen is on right now, and I'm sitting at my own table, in my own house. And outside the oak tree is doing what oak trees do in the dark. I'm still here. That has to count for something. A man called my office and asked what time I usually leave. When my coworker asked who he was, he hung up. 5:47. Every day, 5:47. Not because I was supposed to leave then. My official hours ended at 5:30, same as everyone else in the office, but there was always something. An email that needed finishing, an invoice that didn't balance, a phone call that ran long. I was the kind of person who couldn't leave a thing half done, and the universe, apparently aware of this, made sure there was always a thing half done at 5:30. So it was 5:47, give or take a few minutes, almost every single workday for the better part of 2 years. I'd never thought of it as a vulnerability. That's the part I keep coming back to. The office was small, a property management company, 8 people total, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone's coffee order, and the printer in the corner has a name and a personality that is primarily antagonistic. We were on the second floor of a converted Victorian on a side street downtown, which sounds nicer than it was. The building had good bones and bad heating and a parking lot out back that was too dark in winter and just barely tolerable the rest of the year. I'd been there since I was 29. Took the job because it was stable and the commute was manageable, and I was at a point in my life where stable and manageable felt like enough. My coworker Pauline sat at the front desk. This matters. She was the one who answered the phones, screened the calls, took messages in the spiral notebook she kept next to her monitor, and transferred to a digital system at the end of every week with the kind of methodical patience that I genuinely admired. Nothing got past Pauline. She had worked that front desk for 11 years and had the particular competence of someone who has done a job long enough to have seen every version of it. It was a Tuesday in late February when she told me about the call. I was pulling on my coat, 5:44, a little early for me. I'd finished everything by 5:30 for once and was feeling virtuous about it. Pauline was still at her desk, logging her last notes before shutting down, and she said it the way she said most things, matter-of-factly, without particular alarm, because at that point there was no particular reason for alarm. "Someone called for you earlier," she said. "Around 3. Did they leave a message? That's the thing." She turned in her chair slightly, the way she did when something had been sitting with her. "He asked what time you usually leave, not to talk to you. He didn't ask to be transferred or anything. Just asked what time you leave the office." I stopped with one arm in my coat sleeve. "What did you tell him?" "Nothing. I asked who he was calling on behalf of." She paused. "He hung up." I stood there for a moment, processing that. Then I asked if she recognized the voice, whether he'd given any name at all before she asked, whether the number had shown on the display. Unknown number. No name. Voice she didn't recognize. Male, she thought, middle-aged, nothing distinctive. The call had lasted under 30 seconds. I finished putting my coat on and told her it was probably nothing. A wrong number that had gone on a beat too long, or someone trying to reach a different person who worked different hours. It happened. People called offices for strange reasons and got uncomfortable when questioned and hung up. It didn't have to mean anything. Pauline gave me a look that I have thought about many times since. Not alarmed exactly, more like the look of someone who has decided not to say the thing they're thinking because you've already talked yourself out of hearing it. She turned back to her monitor. "Probably nothing," she agreed. I took the stairs down to the back lot. It was the kind of February evening that arrives before you're ready for it. Full dark by 5:15, a wet cold that got into the gap between your scarf and your collar. No matter how you adjusted it, the parking lot lit by a single overhead lamp that had been flickering for 3 weeks and that our building manager kept promising to fix. My car was one of 4 left in the lot. I got in, locked the doors, started the engine, and sat there while the heat kicked in, which took longer than it should have because the car was old and cold-blooded. I thought about the call while the defroster cleared the windshield. It had a specific shape to it that I didn't love. The narrowness of the question, the fact that he hadn't asked to speak to me or leave a message, just that single piece of information. What time does she leave? And then the hanging up when asked to identify himself. If it was a wrong number, you apologized and hung up. If you were calling legitimately, you gave your name. You didn't go quiet when someone asked who you were and then disconnect. I told myself I was overthinking it. Pulled out of the parking lot and turned onto the main road and joined the thin stream of after-work traffic heading out of downtown. The rain came on about 10 minutes into the drive, light but steady, the kind that requires wipers on the lowest setting and still somehow manages to be annoying. The streetlights bled orange across the wet road. Familiar route, familiar sounds. The particular rhythm of a Tuesday evening commute that I had made so many times, it required almost no conscious navigation at all. Familiar, routine, predictable, 5:47, give or take a few minutes, every single day. I didn't think about that part until later. The second call came the following Thursday. Pauline told me when I came in that morning, before I'd even set my bag down. She'd written it in her notebook the way she wrote everything: time, duration, notes, and she turned it toward me so I could read it. 8:52 a.m. Same unknown number. This time he hadn't asked about my schedule. This time he'd asked whether I drove to work or took the bus. She'd hung up on him herself. I stood at her desk and looked at the notebook entry and felt something shift in the way the previous week hadn't quite managed. The first call could be explained away with enough effort. 2 calls, same number, different questions about my movements. That had a shape to it that effort couldn't smooth out. Someone was building a picture, not of the company, not of our services, not of anything professional, of me, of when I arrived and how I got there, and when I left, and whether I was on foot or in a car. "I think you should tell someone," Pauline said. "I'm going to." I straightened up. "Who do I tell?" That was the first of several moments in this story where the answer to a reasonable question turned out to be more complicated than it should have been. I went to our office manager, a decent man named Gerald, who handled HR alongside approximately 14 other responsibilities and who listened to me carefully and with genuine concern. He agreed it was unsettling. He said he'd look into whether calls could be traced through our phone system. He sent an email to the building manager about the parking lot light, which had now been flickering for a month, and which suddenly felt less like a maintenance issue and more like something else. It was a good email. The light still wasn't fixed. I called the non-emergency police line from my desk that afternoon, explained the 2 calls, the questions, the hang-up when Pauline asked for a name. The officer was polite. He told me that without a direct threat there wasn't much they could action at this stage, but that I should document everything and call back if anything escalated. I wrote down his name and his advice in the same notebook I'd started keeping that week. I drew a line under it. I started paying attention to my commute, not in a paranoid way, or not purely paranoid, in the deliberate way that women learn to pay attention when something has been named. I began noticing the cars that were regularly parked on my street, the ones that were there when I left in the morning and there when I came home at night. I noticed the man who stood at the bus stop 2 blocks from my office most evenings, middle-aged, heavy-set, dark coat, and spent 3 days cataloging whether his presence was routine before I identified him as a genuine bus commuter who caught the 6:15 every single night and was entirely unremarkable. I hated that I'd spent 3 days on him. I hated more that I hadn't been able to stop myself. The third call came on a Monday, 8 days after the second. This one was different. This time he asked for me by name. Pauline put him on hold and came to find me in the back office where I was working through a stack of lease renewals. She kept her voice even and her face neutral in the way that told me she was deliberately keeping both even and neutral. "There's a man on hold asking for you. He knows your name. He called you by your first name." "Did he say who he was?" "No," I asked. "He said you'd know him." The phrase sat in the air between us for a moment. You'd know him. I didn't pick up the call. I told Pauline to take a message and a number, and I went back to my desk and sat there with my hands flat on the surface and breathed. She came in 2 minutes later with her notebook. He'd refused to leave a number. Said he'd call back. Hung up before she could say anything else. I didn't know him. I was almost completely sure of this. There was no voice described, no name given, no detail that pointed anywhere specific. But the phrase was designed to make me doubt that certainty, and it worked for longer than I wanted it to. I spent the rest of that afternoon running through people from my past the way you run your tongue over a sore tooth. An old relationship that had ended badly 3 years ago. A tenant dispute from 18 months back that had gotten heated. A neighbor situation the previous summer that I'd thought was resolved. I kept arriving at the same uncertain place. Maybe, but I didn't know. And not knowing was the point, I think. It was meant to make me feel like the answer was somewhere in my own history, like I had done something to earn this, like the origin was mine to locate and account for. That particular trick is one of the oldest ones there is. Gerald upgraded his response after I told him about the third call. He sent a formal note to all staff asking that any calls requesting personal information about employees be logged, declined, and reported immediately. He also finally got the building manager on the phone about the parking lot, not an email this time, an actual call, and was told the bulb would be replaced by the end of the week. It was replaced the following Wednesday. By then, I had stopped using the back lot entirely. I'd started parking 2 streets over in a paid lot, $8 a day, which I couldn't really afford to absorb indefinitely, but the lot had an attendant until 7 and cameras at both exits, and the walk to the street was short and well lit. I told myself it was temporary. I told myself the calls would stop. The following Thursday, I was working late. Of course I was working late. I was always working late. And Pauline had already gone for the night, and most of the office was empty and quiet, and the rain was coming down hard against the windows when my desk phone rang. I looked at the display. Unknown number. I let it ring 4 times with my hand on the receiver before I picked up. Hello? Silence on the line. Not dead silence. There was background noise, faint and indistinct. Something that might have been traffic or wind or a television in another room. He was somewhere. He was listening. Hello, I said again, and hated how my voice came out. Steady enough, but stripped of everything casual. The voice of someone trying to sound like they aren't afraid. You're working late. Not a question. He knew I was working late because he knew I worked late, because that was the information he had been assembling, call by call, question by question, over the past 3 weeks. The phrase landed in my chest like something cold and physical. The office around me, the empty desks, the dark windows, the rain against the glass, contracted inward, about 6 inches in every direction. I didn't speak. My hand tightened on the receiver. I just want to talk, he said, still calm, still unhurried. That's all. Who is this? You know who this is. I don't. I've never spoken to you before. A pause. You will. I hung up, put the receiver down carefully, the way you put something down when your hands are shaking and you don't want the shake to show up as sound. Then I sat very still at my desk for approximately 10 seconds before I stood up and started moving. Grabbed my bag, my coat off the back of my chair, didn't shut down my computer, didn't finish what I was working on, didn't do any of the small, habitual things I did at the end of every workday. I turned off my desk lamp and crossed the office in the half-dark and hit the stairwell door with my shoulder and went down. The building's front entrance was locked after 6. I'd come in the back way that morning. Key fob, rear door, the parking lot I'd stopped using. I pushed through the rear door now and stepped into the lot, and the rain hit me immediately, cold and hard. The new bulb was on overhead, white and steady, and it lit the lot clearly enough that I could see all 4 corners of it without shadows collecting anywhere. The lot was empty, except for 2 cars. Mine wasn't one of them. I'd been parking 2 streets over for 11 days. I stood in the rain under the light and recalibrated. He knew I was working late. He'd called my office number, which was listed publicly on the company website, so that told me nothing about what else he knew. But the question from the second call, do you drive or take the bus, had been answered for him, presumably by the fact that I'd been parking in the back lot every night for 2 years before I switched. If he'd been watching long enough, he'd seen my car. He might know my car. I did not walk to the paid lot. I called a car instead, stood under the overhang of the rear door with my back against the brick and my phone in both hands, and watched the lot and the alley entrance and the street beyond it while I waited for the little car icon on my screen to navigate toward me. 4 minutes. The rain came sideways under the overhang and soaked the front of my coat. I didn't move away from the wall. I called the police from home that night. Not the non-emergency line this time. I called the non-emergency line, and then, When I felt the conversation tilting toward the familiar, polite inadequacy of last time, I said the words, "I believe I'm being stalked," clearly and without hedging, and asked what my options were. Something in the framing shifted things. A different officer took over the call, asked more specific questions, and told me that given the pattern of contact, I had grounds to pursue a stalking report, which was different from a general complaint and initiated a different process. I filed the report the following morning. Went in person, same as I had with the GPS story. In person is different from a phone call, I'd learned that much. Brought my notebook with every date and time logged, Pauline's entries, Gerald's staff email, everything. The detective I was assigned was a woman named Reyes, who had the particular quality of making you feel like the details you were giving her were going somewhere useful. She took the report seriously. She told me what to expect next and what not to expect, which I appreciated more than false reassurance would have given me. What I should not expect, she said carefully, was a rapid resolution. These cases took time to build. Documentation was everything. I should keep logging every contact, every sighting, if there were sightings, every instance of anything that felt connected. I should vary my routine where I could. Times, routes, parking. I should tell the people closest to me what was happening. I should not engage with him if he called again. I drove home the long way that night. Took 3 different turns I didn't need to take, doubling my commute by 15 minutes, and watched my mirrors with the specific focused attention that had become my new normal. Nothing. Just the wet city streets and the ordinary traffic of a Thursday evening and the rain that had been coming and going all week, like weather that couldn't commit to finishing. I called my sister from my driveway, sat in the car with the engine off, and told her everything from the beginning while the windows fogged slowly around me. She was quiet through most of it. She has always been a better listener than a talker, which is one of the things I love about her. And when I finished, she said, "Are you safe tonight?" "I think so. Yes." "Okay," she said. "Then we figure out the rest." I sat in the fogged-up car in my own driveway for a long time after we hung up. The rain had finally stopped. The neighborhood was quiet, and somewhere out there, a man who knew what time I left work and whether I drove and what my first name was had my office number saved in his phone and believed, for reasons I couldn't access and didn't want to, that I would come to know him. I intended to make sure I never did. For 9 days, nothing happened. No calls to the office, no unknown numbers on my cell, no feeling of being followed on the commute, no cars lingering too long on my street. None of the things I had started cataloging with the grim diligence of someone who has been told that documentation is everything. I logged the absence dutifully. 9 days of nothing, noted in the same notebook as everything else, because Detective Reyes had said to log contact, and I had quietly expanded that mandate to include the silences too. The silences felt like information. I started to wonder if the filing of the report had been enough, if he had somehow learned about it, through what channel I couldn't imagine, and decided the exposure wasn't worth whatever he was building toward. I didn't let myself believe this fully, but I let myself rest against it a little. The way you lean against a wall you're not completely sure will hold. On the 10th day, I saw him. I didn't know it was him at first. That's important because people imagine these moments as immediate and certain, a recognition that arrives with its own soundtrack. It wasn't like that. It was gradual, the way most frightening things are, a series of small observations assembling into a conclusion you don't want to reach. It was a Wednesday, just past 6. I'd left the office at 5:51, later than I'd been trying to leave, still stubbornly unable to abandon a half-finished reconciliation. And I was on the short walk from the office to the paid lot 2 streets over. It was cold and clear, no rain for once, the kind of winter evening where your breath shows and the sky holds the last of the light longer than it should. There were people around. Not crowds, but a reasonable density of after-work foot traffic, enough that I felt the particular relief of not being alone on an empty street. He was on the opposite pavement, maybe 30 feet back, walking in the same direction. Dark coat, the same descriptor Pauline had given me for the bus commuter I'd spent 3 days watching, and I clocked that coincidence and set it aside. Middle-aged, heavy-set, moving at the same pace I was moving, which people do on a shared pavement. It means nothing. I turned the corner onto the street that ran toward the paid lot. He turned the corner. I kept walking. My keys were already in my hand. I'd developed the habit weeks ago, keys out before I reached the lot, no fumbling at the door. The lot attendant's booth was visible halfway down the block, lit from inside, a figure visible through the glass. I fixed my eyes on it. I stopped in front of a shop window, pretended to look at something in the display. There was nothing memorable in it, shoes maybe, or bags. I genuinely couldn't tell you. I stopped and looked, and in the reflection of the glass, I watched the pavement behind me. He slowed, not dramatically, just the subtle reduction in pace of someone who has been matching yours and suddenly finds the target stationary. He didn't stop. That would have been too obvious. But the slowdown was unmistakable, a hitch in his stride that lasted 2 or 3 steps before he resumed normal pace and walked past me without looking in my direction. I watched him in the glass. He didn't glance at the shop window, didn't look at his phone, didn't do any of the things pedestrians naturally do when they happen to pass someone on a pavement. He looked straight ahead and kept moving and turned the corner at the end of the block. I gave it 30 seconds. Then I walked to the lot, quickly, directly, keys already out, and got to the attendant's booth and knocked on the glass and told the man inside that I thought someone had been following me and asked if he'd stay visible while I got to my car. He came out of the booth without hesitating, walked me the 40 feet to my car and stood there while I got in and locked the doors. I will remember that man for the rest of my life, and I never learned his name. I called Detective Reyes from inside the car. She asked me to describe him as precisely as I could while the details were fresh. I did. Height, build, coat, the color of his hair, the way he'd slowed when I stopped. She was writing as I talked. I could hear the pen. She asked which direction he'd gone when he turned the corner. She asked if I'd seen his face clearly enough to identify him. I hadn't. Not well enough. Not at that distance and in that light. The reflection in the glass had given me shape and movement, but not features. "You did exactly the right things," she said, going to the attendant, calling me immediately. "Write down everything you just told me before you drive home. Times, direction, physical description, and bring it in tomorrow." "Do you think it's him?" A pause, short and honest. "I think it's consistent with what you've described. I don't want to tell you yes before I can tell you that with more certainty." I appreciated that. False certainty would have been easier in the moment and worse in every moment after. I wrote everything down in the car before I started the engine, kept the doors locked, checked every mirror before I pulled out of the space, scanned the street at the lot exit in both directions, and drove home by a different route than I'd taken any day that week. My sister called while I was driving, and I let it go to voicemail because I was holding the car with both hands and all of my attention, and I was not going to let myself be distracted by anything until I was parked in my own driveway with the engine off. The voicemail was 3 seconds long, just her saying she was thinking about me and to call when I could. I sat in the driveway and listened to it twice. They identified him 11 days later. Detective Reyes called me on a Tuesday afternoon while I was at my desk, and I knew from the first 2 words of her greeting that it was different from the previous updates. Those had the careful, measured tone of someone reporting incremental progress, nothing resolved yet, keep documenting. This one had a quality of arrival to it. She told me they had a name, a man who lived 4 miles from my office, who had been brought in for questioning the previous day in connection with a separate harassment complaint filed by a woman across the city. Different workplace, different circumstances, same pattern of escalating contact, same methodology. They had connected the 2 cases through phone records. She told me his name. I wrote it down and then sat looking at it for a long time, and the looking didn't produce anything. No recognition, no click of familiarity, nothing that resolved the question I'd been carrying since the 3rd call. I didn't know him. He didn't know me, not really. He knew my schedule and my car and my first name and the number of my desk phone, none of which is knowing a person, all of which is knowing enough. He was charged. I won't detail the specific charges because Detective Reyes advised me early on that the legal process had its own timeline and its own uncertainties, and that I should be careful about building too much of my sense of safety around its outcomes. That was good advice. I tried to follow it. The process moved the way these processes move, slowly, with adjournments and procedural delays and stretches of weeks where nothing seemed to be happening and I had to trust that something was. I was kept informed at each stage. That mattered more than I would have predicted. I stayed at my job. That was a decision I made consciously and with some effort because the reflexive instinct was to leave, to change everything, put distance between myself and the building and the back lot and the Victorian on the side street where my desk phone had rung 4 times with an unknown number. But I had been at that company for 4 years. I had built something there, small and unspectacular and genuinely mine. I was not prepared to let him take it. Pauline put a sign next to her phone, handwritten, slipped into a plastic sleeve, taped to the side of her monitor where she could see it, but callers couldn't. Do not confirm employee schedules or personal information. It was the most Pauline response to all of this that I could have imagined, practical, immediate, permanent. She never mentioned it directly to me. It was simply there the next time I walked past her desk, and it is still there as far as I know, long after the reason for it has been resolved. I think about that sign sometimes, how it exists now as a policy, a small institutional memory of something that happened, protection for whoever sits at my desk or Pauline's desk in the years to come, people who will never know why the sign is there, who will follow the instruction without needing the story behind it. There's something in that I find more comforting than I expected to. The experience leaving something useful behind instead of just leaving a mark. The mark is there too. I won't pretend otherwise. What it did to my relationship with routine is the thing that's hardest to articulate. I had built my life around predictability, the 5:47 departure, the familiar commute, the parking lot I'd used for 2 years without a second thought. Routine had always felt like stability to me, something I'd constructed carefully, something that worked. After this, it felt like a different thing, a pattern, visible from the outside, readable. The same quality that made it reassuring to me made it useful to someone who wanted to know where I'd be and when. I vary things now in ways that have become second nature. I don't leave at the same time 2 days running if I can help it. I take different routes with a deliberateness I've mostly stopped having to think about. I park in different places, not always the paid lot, not always the back lot, sometimes the street a block north, sometimes the structure 2 blocks east. My sister calls this my rotation, which she means affectionately, and which is in fact exactly what it is. I trust Pauline with things I didn't used to trust anyone at work with. That feels like the right outcome of the wrong circumstances, a closeness that came from something difficult and that turned out to be real. She knew something was wrong before I named it. She hung up on him twice on my behalf without being asked. She made the sign. These are not small things. Detective Reyes closed her file eventually and sent me a letter confirming it, the way these cases formally conclude. I folded it and put it in the back of the same notebook I'd kept through all of it. Every date, every call duration, every unknown number, every 9-day silence noted as carefully as every escalation. 112 pages. I keep it because Reyes told me to keep everything, and because some part of me isn't ready to throw away the record of all the ways I paid attention, all the ways the paying attention kept me safe. The last entry in the notebook is from the day I got the letter. 1 line. 5:47, home, doors locked, fine. Old habits die hard. But I picked the time myself that day, stayed a few minutes longer than I needed to, not because I couldn't leave anything half done, but because I wanted to. A small reclamation, a nothing thing that was also not nothing at all. I am still at my desk at 5:47 more often than I should be, but it is mine now in a way it wasn't before, and I know the difference. and that turns out to matter.
I noticed the same car parked on my street every morning. It was only ever there before sunrise. The first time I noticed it, I didn't think about it at all. That's the thing about the human brain. It logs anomalies before the conscious mind catches up, files them somewhere below the threshold of attention, in that peripheral register where you absorb the texture of a familiar environment without actively processing it. I'd lived on Clement Street for 3 years. I knew that block the way you know a place you move through twice a day without looking. The Andersons' minivan in the second driveway, the motorbike that lived under a blue tarp at the curb, the gap where the Delgado's oak had come down in the August storm and hadn't been replaced. I knew what belonged there and what didn't, at some level below thought. The silver sedan didn't belong there. I run in the mornings. Have for about 6 years, 5 days a week. The alarm set for 5:15, regardless of what time I went to bed the night before. It's the kind of habit that stopped feeling like discipline a long time ago and became just the shape of a morning. Shoes by the door, water bottle on the counter, out into whatever the weather is doing by 5:30. November weather in this part of the country is not kind to a person trying to run before sunrise. Cold that has some intent behind it. A darkness that doesn't have the gray pre-dawn softness of September. Just black sky and street lights and your own breath and the specific satisfaction of being one of the only people awake. That's what I liked about it, if I'm being honest. The emptiness of it. Clement Street at 5:30 on a weekday had the quality of a place between states. Inhabited, but not yet occupied. The houses dark behind their windows, the parked cars standing in for the people inside them. Mine was the only movement. I'd run the same route most mornings, a 2-mile loop that took me down Clement, left on Archer, across the park path, and back up the hill. I'd done it so many times that my feet knew it without instruction. I noticed the silver sedan on a Wednesday in the second week of November. Parked at the curb about 4 houses down from mine, on the opposite side of the street, facing away from the direction I ran. Unremarkable car, the kind of mid-sized generic sedan that exists in every color and parks in every neighborhood without announcing itself. No stickers, no identifying marks I could see in the dark. Just sitting there under the gap between 2 streetlights, which meant it was in the darker stretch of the block, which meant I registered it as a shape more than a specific object. I ran past it. That was all. The next morning it was there again. Same spot, same direction, same gap between the streetlights. This time I noticed it in a slightly more conscious way, the brain upgrading the anomaly from background filing to something worth a glance. I looked at it as I passed. Dark inside, windows fogged just slightly the way a car's windows fog on a cold night. No interior light. I looked and kept running and filed it again, this time 1 level higher. By the 5th consecutive morning, I was actively looking for it before I reached the gap between the streetlights. It was always there. That was the thing that moved it from vague attentiveness to something I actually thought about during the day. Not alarm, not yet. Just the low-grade curiosity of a pattern that doesn't have an obvious explanation. Someone working nights, maybe, parking on the street because their own driveway was blocked, arriving home in the dark hours and leaving again before the neighborhood fully woke up. Someone whose schedule ran perpendicular to everyone else's. A reasonable explanation, one of several, none of them alarming. But I started noticing the car wasn't there when I came home from work at 6 in the evening. Wasn't there at 8 p.m., or 10, or whenever I happened to look. And it wasn't there at 5:15 when I was putting my shoes on. I could see that stretch of the block from my front window, and the spot was empty. And then at 5:30, when I came out the door, it was there, not arriving, already there, which meant it arrived in the 15 minutes between when I looked and when I stepped outside, at 5:20-something every morning, in the dark, quietly, on a residential street where nothing else moved at that hour. And left. I checked, started checking. before 7, before the neighborhood roused itself, before anyone who might be described as a regular witness was awake to see it come or go. I want to be careful about how I describe what happened next in my thinking, because I'm aware that a person can talk themselves into a threat that isn't there just as easily as they can talk themselves out of one that is. I know this about myself. I tend toward the analytical. I like explanations. I'm more comfortable with a named thing than an unknown one. So when the silver sedan started occupying a corner of my thoughts on the runs and at my desk and in the evenings when I was cooking dinner, I made a genuine effort to interrogate whether I was constructing something from coincidence and pattern recognition and the slightly overactive imagination that 5:30 solo runs in the dark will produce if you let them. I made the effort. I was honest about it. And at the end of the effort, I kept coming back to the same two facts, which were simple and resistant to the reassuring explanation I was trying to build around them. The car arrived in the dark, in a 15-minute window that corresponded precisely with the time I prepared to leave my house, and it was always gone before the street woke up. Not parked there, not a neighbor's overnight guest, not someone working nights who happened to favor this block. There and gone, specifically in the window surrounding my movement. I started looking at it more carefully as I passed. On the 9th morning, running by on the opposite sidewalk with my head turned toward it, I saw something I hadn't been able to make out before. The driver's window. Fogged from the cold, same as always. Except this morning, there was a gap in the condensation on the inside of the glass, roughly the size of a hand, the shape of someone having wiped a clear patch in the fog to see through, positioned at eye level, aimed from that spot between the streetlights at the front of my house. I kept running. That's the first thing I want to say about it. I didn't stop, didn't slow down, didn't stand on the opposite sidewalk staring at the car like a person in a film who has forgotten that the thing watching them can see them watching back. I kept my pace, and I kept my eyes forward, and I ran the rest of the loop on autopilot, my body doing the work, while my mind sat somewhere behind my sternum turning over what I'd just seen. The cleared patch, the size of a palm. Someone inside that car, in the dark, who had reached up and wiped the condensation off the inside of their window to see through it. Not to see the street generally. The whole window would have done that. The defroster would have done that. A specific patch. The minimum visibility required to watch a specific point from a specific seat. I got home, stretched on the porch the way I always did, and looked across at the spot between the streetlights. The car was still there. I went inside, showered, made coffee, sat at the kitchen table with my laptop open and my back to the window because I'd decided, consciously and immediately, that I was not going to stand at my own front window looking out at a car on my street. That felt important. Some instinct about not advertising what I knew, not changing my behavior in a way that would be visible from outside. So I sat with my back to it and drank my coffee, and by the time I left for work at 8:15, the spot was empty. I started a note in my phone that morning. Date, time of arrival estimate, time of departure, anything else observable. The runner's habit of logging. I tracked my mileage, my pace, my route variations, and now I extended that same methodology to this. It gave me something to do with the information other than just carry it, and it gave me documentation if documentation ever became necessary, which I was beginning to think it might. I told my neighbor about it 4 days later. His name is Walt, late 60s, retired, the kind of neighbor who actually knows the block because he's lived on it for 22 years and has the attentiveness that comes from being home during the hours when the rest of us are elsewhere. He knows every car that belongs on Clement Street, knows the rotation of the Andersons' vehicles, knows which houses get regular overnight visitors, knows the difference between a delivery truck and a service vehicle at a glance. If anyone could tell me whether the silver sedan had a legitimate explanation I hadn't thought of, it was Walt. He frowned when I described it. The consistent arrival window, the position between the street lights, the departure before 7. I showed him the note I'd been keeping. 9 entries by then, 9 consecutive mornings. Arrival times clustered between 5:18 and 5:24. Departures between 6:40 and 6:55 on the mornings I'd been able to confirm them. "What kind of silver sedan?" he asked. I described what I could. Mid-size, no distinguishing features I'd been able to make out in the dark. No plate I'd been close enough to read. He shook his head slowly. Didn't recognize it as belonging to anyone on the block or any regular visitor he could play. "You get a look at the driver at all?" I hadn't. The windows were always fogged enough, the light always wrong, my angle always oblique enough from the running side of the street that I'd never been able to see more than the presence of a shape inside the car. A person. That was all I could confirm. That the car was occupied. That someone sat in it in the dark before sunrise on my street every morning and left before the world woke up. Walt said I should call the non-emergency line. Said it matter-of-factly, not alarmingly, the way he said most things. I told him I wasn't sure what I'd report. A parked car, legally parked, doing nothing I could articulate as a threat. He gave me a look that was part understanding and part something more serious. "You've got 9 mornings of documentation," he said. "That's not nothing." He was right, but I still hesitated. And I think the hesitation was about the same thing it's always about in these situations. The specific social calculus of a person, particularly a man, trying to report a feeling, a pattern, something that exists in the gap between observable fact and actionable threat. The car was not doing anything I could point to, and yet... I changed my run that Saturday. Not the time, 5:30 as always, but the route, looping back past the spot from the opposite direction so that I'd approach the car from behind rather than passing it face forward. I'd been thinking about the angle, coming at it from behind in the dark, moving quietly the way you do on an early run with no one around. I might be close enough to read the plate before whoever was inside knew I was there. The car was in its spot. I came at it from behind on the far side of the street, keeping to the edge of the pool of light from the nearest lamp, and I got close enough to see the plate, close enough to see something else too, something I hadn't anticipated, something that stopped me mid-stride on a cold Saturday sidewalk at 5:47 in the morning. The rear window, the condensation on the rear window, same as the driver's side, the same cold night fogging of glass. But on the rear window there was no cleared patch, no wiped circle. Instead, pressed against the inside of the glass from within the car, were 2 pale shapes that my brain processed in sequence, first as objects, then as what they actually were, hands. Palms flat against the glass, fingers spread. Both of them side by side, the hands of someone in the back seat pressing against the rear window from the inside, pressing outward. I stood on the sidewalk and my legs went the particular unreliable kind of weak that isn't about physical strength and is entirely about the body's response to something the mind hasn't finished processing yet. The hands were still, not moving, not waving, not gesturing, just pressed there against the fogged glass, pale and flat and completely motionless. The way hands look when the person attached to them is either very calm or has been there for a long time. 2 people. There had been 2 people in that car every morning, and only one of them had been watching my house. I want to tell you I ran. I want to tell you that the correct animal response fired immediately, and I turned and put distance between myself and that car before my conscious mind had caught up. Instead, I stood there, frozen on the sidewalk with my breath coming in short, visible clouds, looking at those 2 pale hands pressed flat against the rear glass. 5, 6, 7 seconds of standing completely still on a cold Saturday street at 5:47 in the morning, when nobody else in the world was awake to see it, or me, or any of it. The hands didn't move, didn't wave,
didn't react to my presence at all, which was somehow worse than if they had. The possibility that whoever they belonged to didn't know I was there, or didn't care, or had been sitting in that position for long enough that it had simply become how they waited.
Then the driver's door opened. Not fast, not aggressively. It swung open the way a door opens when the person behind it has decided to open it and is not particularly concerned about the effect that will have. And a man got out, unhurried. He stood with the door between us and looked across the roof of the car at me. Medium height, dark coat, his face in the shadow of the streetlight behind him so that I got shape more than features. He didn't say anything. He just stood there with his hand on the top of the open door and looked at me. I turned and ran. Not the measured pace of a morning run. The other kind. The kind the body keeps in reserve for specific circumstances. The full extension sprint of a person who is not thinking about their route or their breathing or anything at all except the distance between themselves and what's behind them. I went back the way I'd come, taking the longer way around rather than passing the car, and I didn't look back until I reached my front door and I was inside with the deadbolt thrown. I stood in my entry hall, breathing hard, hands braced on my knees, and listened. Quiet street, my own breathing. Nothing. I called Walt from the kitchen, still in my running gear, still not fully down from the adrenaline. He picked up on the fourth ring. He's an early riser, but 5:52 is early even for him. And I told him about the hands, and the man, and the plate number I'd managed to retain despite everything, locked in by the same mechanical part of my brain that logs anomalies before the conscious mind arrives. He was quiet through all of it. Then he said to call the police and stay inside, and that he'd walk out and check the street himself. The car was gone by the time the officer arrived 40 minutes later. Walt confirmed it. He'd gone to his front window as soon as we hung up and watched the silver sedan pull away from the curb within 2 minutes of my running, moving without hurry down Clement toward the Archer intersection and out of sight. The officer was a young woman named Park, thorough and direct in a way I appreciated immediately. She took down everything. The 9 days of documentation I read to her from my phone note, the plate number, the physical description of the man, the hands in the rear window. She looked at my note with what I recognized as genuine attention rather than the performative kind. When I described the arrival window, 5:18 to 5:24, 9 consecutive mornings, always in the 15 minutes between my checking the street and stepping outside, I watched her expression do something precise and focused. "Has anything happened recently that felt off?" she asked. "Before you first noticed the car, any sense that someone had been watching you, following you, paying unusual attention?" I thought about it. The honest answer was no, not that I'd noticed. But I was also beginning to understand that my noticing had been limited by the context of when and where I looked. The car operated specifically in my blind spots, the pre-dawn dark, the 15 minutes I wasn't at my window, the stretch of the block between the 2 streetlights. Whatever else might have been happening in the hours and places I wasn't attending to, I wouldn't necessarily have caught. "Not that I know of," I said. She ran the plate that afternoon, called me back at 3:17 p.m. with the registration information, and then, after a pause that told me something complicated was coming, with a second piece of information she'd turned up in the process. The registered owner of the vehicle had a prior, a stalking charge from 4 years ago, filed by a woman in a neighboring county, that had resulted in a restraining order. The order had lapsed 18 months prior. There had been no subsequent charges. I sat with that for a long moment. The weight of it. A person who had done this before. Specifically this, the watching, the pre-dawn parking, the patient mapping of someone else's routine, and had served whatever consequence the system imposed, and was now, apparently, doing it again, to me, on my street. For at least 9 documented mornings, and for however long before I started documenting. What does that mean for what happens next? I asked. Officer Park was honest in the way that I was coming to understand meant she respected me enough not to soften it unnecessarily. The prior established a pattern, she said. That was significant. It gave the investigation context it wouldn't otherwise have. But a prior from 4 years ago in a different county under a lapsed order complicated rather than simplified the current situation. There were jurisdictional questions, evidentiary thresholds, the practical reality that a legally parked car and a man standing beside it constituted the most visible portion of the documented behavior. She was pursuing it, she said. And she said it with enough firmness that I believed her. But I also heard the gap underneath the firmness. The gap between pursuing and resolved. The gap where the car could come back tomorrow morning at 5:23 and park between the 2 streetlights and wait for me to open my front door. And there was nothing yet in place to stop it. Walt called that evening. He'd been thinking about it all day, he said. He wanted me to know that he'd be up early for the foreseeable future, and that he had a view of that stretch of the block from his upstairs window, and that I should text him if I needed eyes on the street before I came out. I thanked him. I meant it more than I could say. I reset my alarm for 7:30 that night. Didn't run the next morning. Didn't run for a week after that. The dark had belonged to me for 6 years. My street, my loop, the specific solitary satisfaction of moving through a neighborhood that didn't know I was there. I'd built something in those pre-dawn hours that mattered to me. A practice, a rhythm, a version of my own mornings that was mine in a way that very few things are purely yours. I hadn't understood, until I lost it, how much it had cost me nothing to have it. The car came back on Thursday. Not to the spot between the streetlights. It was smarter than that now, or he was. Walt had his upstairs window, and I had his number, and whoever had been sitting in that car for 9 mornings understood, after the Saturday sprint and the police visit and the plate running, that the specific arrangement that had worked before was no longer available to him. So he adapted. Walt texted me at 5:31 a.m. 3 words. Silver car. Archer. Archer was the cross street at the bottom of my running loop. Far enough from my house that it wouldn't have triggered the instinct to check. I looked at my window onto Clement. Always Clement. The stretch of block I'd learned to surveil. Archer was around the corner and out of sight, positioned at the point where my route turned back toward home. The point where, on any given morning run, I would have been alone on a path between 2 pools of streetlight with my back to the street behind me. He hadn't stopped. He'd relocated. I texted Walt back, "Don't go outside." Then I called Officer Park directly. She'd given me a card with her direct number, which I'd put in my phone under her name the same day she gave it to me. She picked up on the second ring. I told her about Walt's text, about the Archer location, about what that position meant relative to my route. There was a brief silence on her end that I recognized as the sound of someone rapidly reorganizing their understanding of a situation. "Stay inside," she said. "I'm sending a patrol car." Walt had his phone out the whole time, watching from his upstairs window at an angle that gave him partial sight of the Archer intersection. He texted me a running account in the abbreviated style of a man who is concentrating on watching and can't spare the attention for full sentences. Still there, engine off, nobody on street. Then, patrol coming down Clement. Then a longer pause before. Car moved, going west on Archer toward the park. The patrol car arrived at the intersection 40 seconds after the sedan pulled away. I know the sequence because Officer Park walked me through it afterward, sitting in my living room with the door double-locked and Walt in the armchair across from me where I'd insisted he come inside after it was over. The patrol officer had a partial visual on the vehicle heading toward the park road, the long service road that ran along the park perimeter and connected to the highway on-ramp at the northern end. He'd followed, but lost it at the on-ramp, where traffic from the early commuters made distinguishing a generic silver sedan from 3 other silver vehicles impractical. He was gone again. Same as he'd always been gone. Quietly, without incident, into the ordinary world where a mid-sized sedan is invisible by design. Officer Park sat in my living room and told me that the investigation had progressed. The plate and the prior had been enough to open a formal case. Detectives in the neighboring county had been contacted. The woman who'd filed the original stalking charge 4 years ago had been reached, had spoken at length, and provided documentation from her own experience that mapped in several specific ways onto what I'd reported. The pre-dawn timing, the logging of a target's routine, the patient accumulation of presence before any direct contact was attempted. I asked what had happened in her case, whether he'd made contact, whether it had escalated beyond the watching. Park said she couldn't share the details of that case with me. She said it carefully, in a way that told me the answer was not reassuring. I didn't ask again. What I did ask, what I'd been building toward since the car moved to Archer and I understood that the adaptation meant intention, that the relocation meant I was being thought about specifically and systematically, was what I was supposed to do. Not legally, not procedurally, practically, day to day, Monday through Friday, with a running route that took me past an intersection he now knew I used, in a neighborhood where he'd shown he could operate across multiple positions, in the pre-dawn hours that had always been mine and now felt like something else entirely. Park was honest. She said a restraining order was being pursued, that the compiled documentation, mine and Walt's and the patrol log, constituted strong grounds. She said the timeline for formal issuance was days, not weeks. She said in the meantime I should vary my times, vary my route, not run alone if I could avoid it, and make sure Walt kept his phone on. Walt, across from me in the armchair, was already nodding. He was 70 years old and retired, and had lived on Clement Street for 22 years, and had not, I suspected, anticipated being involved in anything like this when he woke up that morning. He'd gotten up before 5:30 to watch the block because I'd asked him to, and because he was the kind of person who does what he says he'll do. He had his phone charged and on the nightstand. He had the number saved. I looked at him and thought about how randomly that kind of person enters a life. Through a mailbox conversation, through proximity, through nothing more deliberate than living next to each other for 3 years and being the sort of people who wave. How much depended on that accident of adjacency? "Thank you," I said. It didn't cover it. He waved it off in the way of a man who doesn't need to be thanked for doing what seemed obvious. The restraining order was issued 6 days later. That evening I sat at my kitchen table with the paperwork and a cup of coffee that went cold while I read it twice. And then I looked out my front window at Clement Street in the early dark of a November evening. The Andersons' minivan, the motorbike under its tarp, the gap where the Delgado's oak had been. The spot between the 2 streetlights, empty, and staying that way. I went to bed early, set my alarm for 5:15. I wasn't sure yet whether I'd run, but I wanted the option back. I ran the following Monday. Not at 5:30, at 6:15, which was later than I liked, the sky already beginning to go gray at the eastern edge, the neighborhood stirring rather than still. Walt had offered to walk out with me for the first few mornings, an offer so pragmatic and unsentimental that I'd accepted it before I thought about what it meant to need it. He wore a yellow windbreaker and running shoes that looked new and walked rather than ran, keeping pace beside me with the steady gait of a man who has no interest in being anywhere else. We didn't talk much. The block was quiet in the early gray light, frost on the car roofs, the spot between the streetlights empty and unremarkable, just a stretch of curb. I ran the full loop. It took 18 minutes, and I checked the Archer intersection without breaking stride, and it was empty. And by the time I came back up the hill toward Clement, my chest was doing something complicated that I couldn't entirely blame on the cold or the elevation. It took about 3 weeks before 5:30 felt like mine again. 3 weeks of incrementally earlier alarms, Walt walking out with me on the first few, and then standing on his porch with his coffee until I was around the corner.
and then eventually just being awake in the house behind a lit window that I could see from the street, which was enough. Which was, in the end, all I needed. The knowledge of a lit window, a person inside it, someone who knew my route and my timing and would notice the difference between my coming back and not coming back. That knowledge changed the texture of those mornings in a way I'm still trying to find the right words for. Not worse, different, less solitary. The dark still belonged to me, but it had an acknowledgement in it now, a small human awareness running alongside the solitude. I'd valued the emptiness of those pre-dawn runs for 6 years. I still valued it. But I'd also learned what the emptiness could hold that I hadn't known was there, and the lit window in my peripheral sense of the block had become something I actively wanted rather than something I'd have chosen against before all of this. The formal stalking charge was filed against him in January. Park called me herself to tell me in the early evening, and I stood at my kitchen window watching Clement Street in the dark and felt something unknot in my chest that had been knotted since November. Not fully, nothing like fully, but this specific knot that belongs to not knowing, to the open-ended gap between documented behavior and consequence, loosened enough that I noticed its absence. The case was complicated by the jurisdictional history, as Park had anticipated. The original charge from 4 years prior in the neighboring county had resulted in a negotiated plea, a lesser charge, probation, the restraining order that had since lapsed. The woman who had filed it had complied with every request from the current investigation, with what I understood, reading between the lines of how Park described it, was a significant personal cost. She'd gone through it once already and was going through the edges of it again, her prior experience freshly surfaced because her documentation was relevant to establishing a pattern, and she'd chosen to provide it. I think about her sometimes. More than sometimes. I don't know her name. Park couldn't share that, and I wouldn't have asked. But I know that whatever he'd done in her case had been enough that the courts had imposed a restraining order. And I know she'd answered the phone when the investigators called. And I know the shape of what that call probably cost her. There's a particular kind of courage in that I don't have a clean word for. Quiet, practical, offered to a stranger in a neighboring county who would never know her face. He pleaded guilty in March. I was notified by letter, 3 sentences on official stationery that gave me the fact and the sentence and a case number and nothing else. The sentence was not what I would have chosen. It never is in these cases, from what I understand, and understanding that doesn't make it less true. I still live on Clement Street. This surprises people when I tell them. The assumption seems to be that you'd move, that the association with the block would make staying impossible. But the block was mine before he put his car on it, and I'd invested 3 years in the particular texture of it, and the Andersons and their minivan, and Walt and his yellow windbreaker, and the motorbike under its blue tarp were all still there, unchanged, not contaminated by what had happened on that stretch of curb between the 2 streetlights. The block didn't become his because he parked on it. It stayed mine. What changed is smaller and more permanent than geography. I notice cars now with a different quality of attention. Not anxiety, not the hair-trigger alertness of those first weeks after the Saturday sprint, but a settled, unhurried awareness of what belongs on a street and what doesn't. How long something has been there, whether it was there yesterday, whether the windows are fogged in a way that means something, or in the way that all windows fog on a cold night when no one is inside. I've learned to read a parked car the way Walt reads them, as information, specific and legible, once you know what questions to ask of it. My alarm still goes off at 5:15. On the mornings I run, I'm out the door by 5:30, the loop down Clement and left on Archer and through the park path and back up the hill, the route my feet know without instruction. The darkness is still good in the way it was always good, still mine in the way that mattered. Walt still leaves his light on.
I've never asked him to. He just does it. The upstairs window lit when I come back up the hill toward the house. The quiet signal of a person who knows the difference between someone coming home and not coming home, and has decided, without making anything of it, to be the one who notices. I pass the spot between the two streetlights every morning. It's just a stretch of curb, an empty patch of asphalt between two pools of light, unremarkable, belonging to no one. I know what it held. I know what it doesn't anymore. That's enough.